During the unfortunate Donald Trump presidency, the issue of censorship gained salience, especially in regards to social media. When people wanted to push inane, unscientific vaccine conspiracies on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, for instance, during a deadly global pandemic, those platforms slapped them down in the interest of public health. In response, many of those people cried foul. Insert bird screeches here. Get it? Foul. I'm hilarious. Libertarian Ron Paul, for instance, ran into roadblocks on Facebook. Alleged comedian Jimmy Dore gets accused of misinformation on YouTube a bunch. When Donald Trump was lying on Twitter about the results of the 2020 election, claiming despite a lack of evidence that it was rigged and stolen, Twitter gave it a misinformation label. In response, certain conservatives freaked the freak out, but not in a fun way. When noted bigot Steven Crowder would go viral, everyone would point out that he was selling merch that said, his fanboys would point and laugh when this happened and go, oh, clearly he's saying figs. You can't take a joke. If you think it says the F slur, you're the homophobe. So what's the joke? The joke comes from people getting offended by something that is clearly intended for bigotry and to get the response of, isn't that meant to be that? And pretending to then be removed by a layer of irony as if that absolves them of the act. Crowder ended up changing his header image on social media after one firestorm about this clearly bigoted merchandise. I haven't checked up on him in a couple of years, so I don't know if that's still the case. That header had been showcasing that joke. I was one of the people who reported it for hate speech, by the way, so I'm glad someone listened. So obviously, online conservatives are warriors out there to defend free speech, right? They want to make sure it's never infringed on the internet, right? They lobbied Elon Musk to reverse the bans on several popular Twitter accounts after he got ownership of the platform, and they celebrated when he did so. Surely, they didn't then go on to celebrate when that same sort of banning happened to figures that they disliked, right? I mean, obviously, no one online is a hypocrite, and obviously, everyone online actually cares about whether or not they're a hypocrite. I mean, who can stand a contradiction? Oh, well, it turns out everyone. As long as it's an internal contradiction that they're okay with or don't have to think about all that often or all that hard. Now, you know the joke. Why can't I say the N-word or some other slur? And then the response in the meme is, why do you want to say it? And then the stuttering starts because dirtbags of all persuasions are actually babies when subjected to the gentlest questioning of their goals and motives. I did a very deep dive into Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, a disgustingly homophobic and transphobic law pushed by extremist Ron DeSantis and others in Florida, whose true goal was to keep children in the closet and broadly paint all queer people as groomers. In that same video, I went over the nonsense of Trump-appointed judges who ruled a Florida city's conversion therapy ban was unconstitutional. These judges claimed that it violated the First Amendment and that the government couldn't compel or regulate talk therapy in that regard because it's speech and not medicine, which is insanely nonsensical, but for all the left-leaning people wanting to inflict the Republicans as punishment for Biden, that's explicitly the method the GOP aims to use to keep torturing gay children across the country. Trans-affirming efforts like using preferred pronouns and names, no, those can be banned for sure. Parents not allowed to consent to affirming talk therapy, yeah, that's an okay ban, but parents must be allowed to do conversion torture on their gay kids. Now you may say, wow, that sounds like they don't actually care about speech at all, and it's just a tool to push their restrictive authoritarian governance and tendencies to promote their wants and punish their opponents. Correct. Welcome to the Republican Party. Welcome to politics in general. It's been a bit since I've focused on conservatives. In my past couple of videos, I've talked about trends on the left that have annoyed me, found idiotic or harmful. So here's a little reminder. Hi, I'm a social democrat. I think conservatives are far more dangerous than the handful of fringe leftists who fantasize about doing a violent revolution that's not going to happen. Neither should have power, but the vast majority of leftists aren't like that. And one of those two groups does have power. One has the ability to win elections, and that group is quickly trying to ruin the internet and art as a whole. Now, stop me if you've heard this before. Looking at the state of contemporary movies, TV, music, games, and literature, there's an overabundance of sex. All of these sex scenes are unnecessary. They're exploitative by nature. They're voyeuristic. They're amoral. They don't advance the plot. They don't advance the characters enough to justify not cutting to black. Sex scenes are a result of writers and directors being too self-indulgent and self-obsessed. Proper restraint would have prevented their work from getting so infected. And here's just a side note. People don't like it when I use stupid voices because they find it condescending. I use stupid voices for everyone because I think stupid voices are fun to do. If that's not your jam, then I'm just not your jam. It's okay. Go. Bye. It's fine. Now, we most commonly associate that line of thinking with what's derisively called pure teens. You might have heard the uncomfortable feeling term woke scold used to describe the demographic. You know, SJW kids who have gone so far into their ideologies that they've turned around and accidentally become Puritan evangelicals. Often without the religious angle, so there's not even the "but it's for God" game that evangelicals pretend to be playing. So today we're gonna get a little bit spicy for YouTube and talk about the censorship of spicy content. What ways does it manifest? What excuses does it use? What do they get wrong about NSFW content? And who else might be behind this screed? It's not gonna shock you. 1. Salacious, Censorious, Scissors. In that insanely long video I did on the GOP and Don't Say Gay, in that video I talked about so-called reintegrative therapy. That's a rebrand for conversion therapy nonsense, and it's endorsed explicitly by the Texas GOP by name in their state platform. Wow, the parties are the exact same. It's headed up by a homophobe named Dr. Joseph Nicolosi Jr. Baby boy is carrying on his father's torch. Joseph Nicolosi Sr. is the man behind reparative therapy, which, yes, was the previous rebrand attempt for torturing the gay out of the gays. Baby loves his daddy. And we know this because he's super concerned with preserving and protecting his father's legacy. So much so that he threw a little baby fit when retail juggernaut Amazon removed some of his daddy's abusive, homophobic books from their website. He claims science supports him and daddy. It does not. One of the things little baby boy complains about in his Daily Wine article is that Amazon still carried Mein Kampf on its website. Now, what possible morals could be guiding one to ban one book and not the other? Well, obviously he doesn't actually care because a man who's pushing ex-gay pseudoscience doesn't have an understanding of facts or morals or literature or humanity. But let's actually think about it. You know, on one hand, you have the manifesto of a genocidal dictator of great interest to historians and a first-hand source into his thoughts and propaganda techniques that can be studied and critiqued by students of history, politics, communication, English, and philosophy. It's widely understood to be a horrible book written by a horrible man who did horrible things. And yes, it is often bought and worshipped by people who love those horrible things. On the other hand, you have unscientific books by a relatively unknown psychologist who should have lost his license, pretending to be nonfiction scientific guides on how to make sure your kids are straight. Does the second option have the same level of scholarly significance and cultural connotation that make its dangers in fictions clear? Well, here's a different question. Should restrictions be more strict on fiction or nonfiction? I know that's unrelated, but jumping off point. If something purports to be factual and advocates for harm, is that worse than something that's fictional that includes harmful or potentially harmful material? A lot of times in debates over fiction, you see people get caught up in a debate of whether or not fiction affects reality. In a video responding to Sargon of Akkad, YouTuber Big Joel presents a hypothetical Nazi film named Lubin Schubin. That's a fun name. I like that he made up that. Lubin Shubin, it's fun to say. A movie that would celebrate those sorts of people. In his hypothetical, no one is influenced by the film because society is already anti-Nazi and engages with the film critically. Or the people who would agree with it are already maximally Nazi, so it has no ability to affect real life one way or the other. But, he says, it's still an immoral work because it agrees with evil actions. In a pinned comment beneath the video, he argues further that it isn't merely an object inscribed with a bad message. Art is an action. It is what it advocates for. He also makes a point that art obviously affects reality in some way or another. It invokes emotional and intellectual responses. Ads are art, and they obviously influence whether or not someone buys something. So then, can art be morally wrong? Yes. Can it influence people to do bad things? Probably also yes, to a degree, likely in someone who already has proclivities towards certain actions. But I also think that that's maybe too simple of a way of thinking about art, not Joel's hypothetical, but the idea that I built up by mentioning it. We'll go into fantasy and depiction in a later section, including a conversation of ContraPoints' Twilight video, but I needed to bring the idea of it up here so as to build a slight base for us to understand at least the surface reason for why one might censor fiction. When Florida banned queer characters from their school libraries, for instance, the idea pushed was that of social contagion. Ooh, I caught the gay. The books would make the kids gay. You know, that's not how that works. And they don't really believe that either. They're not exactly idiots. But it is an easier argument to make. People are quick to grasp their pearls when you pretend what you care about is the safety of children. Once you've built that shaky platform, you can start throwing things off the plank with a smile. So, what shaky boats are used to attempt to restrict the world of art? Amazon. Kindle Direct Publishing is one of the most popular arenas for self-publishing currently in the market. It helps that they're an online distributor with a massive market for its retail side with a wildly popular ebook reader. As the majority of reading now is done through ebook, it makes sense that they've become a juggernaut in the industry. Self-publishing is fantastic. It does remove some of the gatekeepers from getting the work of we writers out there while allowing us to get paid for it. The traditional publishing route is also great. There are dozens of pros and cons for both sides there. Plenty of authors do both. Plenty swear by one or the other. But either way, there is no debating the popularity of Amazon and Kindle Direct Publishing, KDP. As an article on Publishers Weekly says, in a story about trends in erotica or erotic romance must reckon with Amazon's impact on the genres. The company's dominance as an ebook distribution platform and its squeamishness towards sexual content gives it tremendous influence in determining what's popular. See, I do stupid voices all the time. And of course, Amazon is going to have guidelines on what you can and cannot publish through them. Their content guidelines read, "We don't sell certain content, including content that we determine is hate speech, promotes the abuse or sexual exploitation of children, contains pornography, glorifies rape or pedophilia, advocates terrorism, or other material we deem inappropriate or offensive." On hearing that, your first thought may be, oh, that's a little vague there at the end. And you would be right. It is purposefully vague. And apparently, when they flag you for violation, they aren't necessarily going to be of any help. Author Nikki Sloan tried to sell Sorted on Amazon. When it was removed, she asked why, and they continuously pointed her to the vague guidelines and refused to clarify. Eventually, she got, "If there are scenes in the book that society would object to, that I should remove them." You may be thinking, wow, society objects to a lot of things at various points in time. In a lot of media. How entirely unhelpful. Of course, Sorted is for sale on Amazon. That's because Sloan found a publisher for it. Now, in her interview with HuffPost, she makes clear that she was not going to bend the knee to Amazon, so assumedly the content did not change between what she wanted to self-publish and what eventually got published. Amazon's policies change depending on who's selling. That double standard led Noah Berlatsky at Salon to say, "Its decisions, in short, seem to be based neither on principle nor on a desire to protect its consumers, but simply on panic, ignorance, and the knee-jerk impulse of the Billy, who kicks the smallest kid and scurries away from anyone larger. Given all of that, if you're looking to publish something that may be risque, you do great to end up on some Reddit forums for writers, such as r/erotica writers. Through research of what's been previously banned and gotten authors in trouble, they've compiled a useful, non-exhaustive list of what gets you thrown in the Amazon dungeon or your account nuked. Now, for the sake of not getting nuked myself by the YouTube gods, hi buddy, I might not be extremely explicit here, but through some very clever coded language, I know I'm so smart. Let's go over what's banned. On Amazon, you cannot have family, pets, magic creatures, dubcon, no thank yous. We agreed beforehand that I'm saying no thank you, but actually, yes please. Synchronized yellow swimming, chocolate, gore, nom noms, unaliving, Eureka O'Hara on Bossy Rossi. Did you roll your eyes at how I worded some of that? Did you catch the TikTok standard English of unaliving, the dumbest thing to happen to the internet lexicon? So, for NSFW content, what does that mean? Well, it means, for instance, a lot of Omegaverse is off limits. Heat cycles enter into dubcon, as does the use of drugs and alcohol. Werewolves have to be fully human when being intimate. Stories of intimate exploration that include initial trauma as the starting point or as a moment of conflict are a no-go. From what I've gathered, it also doesn't matter if that initial scene is meant to be erotic or not. You can't have bladders, and you can't make jokes about gay accidents. No rip-offs of Cell from Dragon Ball Z snacking on androids. Erotic thrillers and erotic horrors, well, you better not really lean too hard into the horror or thriller aspect or you're gonna get gone quick. Now, before we go on, I have a question. What is genre? Is it real? Obviously, it's a social construct more than most social constructs are social constructs, but still, what is genre? What is erotica? What's the difference between erotica and romance? Between erotica and any piece of writing that includes spicy scenes? Author Chloe Alice Balkin says on her WordPress that, for a story to be erotica, the primary plot must be one of sexual discovery. Our identities change, our comforts change, our interests change, our bodies change. This is the central theme of erotica. She goes on to argue that erotic romance is not erotica, but a subgenre of romance. So what is romance? Well, it's not just a love story. Any author or publishing professional is going to tell you it's a love story that has a happily ever after or a happily for now ending. If it doesn't end with those two things, it might be romantic, but it isn't romance. Balkin then goes on to talk about how the two genres are often a bit muddy. You can typically tell which is which, but that doesn't mean they aren't similar. That doesn't mean there's no mud there. And of course, afterwards, she goes on to complain about Amazon, which, by the by, doesn't let you advertise erotica. So, if they decide something is one or the other, depends on whether or not you can ask people to come buy it on their site. Let's take it back a half measure. There's a difference between romantic stories and romance. So then, is there a difference between erotic stories and erotica? Well, yes. For something to be erotic just means it titillates. Lots of people find different things erotic. Some tremble at horror movies. Some get bothered over long build-up with brushed hands or furious blushes. Some like philosophy. Some find nothing better than the idea of washing their partner in the bath, getting all clean. So that's when we ask, is its purpose to excite? A lot of people insist that's what makes it erotica, but I don't really think so. I think that makes it purposefully erotic. No involved. Well, maybe for the characters. But, for instance, you can probably think of a handful of non-horror movies, books, manga, what have you, but who have scary scenes whose purposes are to frighten you. Do those scenes make said pieces horror? Probably not. You have to look at the broader context. Erotica then is not simply a story with spice aimed to give you heat. I agree with Balkin, the spice has to be the core of the narrative. It drives the character development. It is about that. But when you're comparing it to spicy romance, where's the line? ContraPoints makes a joke about it in her film on Twilight, saying she emailed a bunch of literary departments who determined romance is for good girls and erotica is for sluts. The joke is referencing the fraught distinction. If romance and erotica are different genres, when you get close to that separating line, who can truly say what's on either side of it? That brings me back to Amazon. Genre is a tricky thing. You end up having to trust the categorization of authors or readers. They say you shouldn't purposefully label things as romance that are erotica, but the sincere question is, what if you disagree on what that means? There's not a strict definition out there. So when Amazon is stricter with what it publishes in the erotica genre, when it doesn't allow advertisement for it, how does that play into censorship of other genre work that isn't actually erotica? They don't like non-con. I have a question about horror novels. Say someone writes an assault scene detailed enough to bring about terror. That detail can also be misconstrued as titillation regardless of intent. Does authorial intent matter, or does it matter of the person who's reading it for Amazon? Now, which is it going to be taken as? Is it suddenly bannable erotica, or is it allowable, terrifying horror with an uncomfortable sexual moment? A horror writer actually posted about a situation similar to this on the KDP forum boards, confused and scared as to why his books were getting flagged and miscategorized as erotica by the site. Eventually, he managed to work it out through email when they actually read his work and realized that he was writing horror. A romance author made a note of a similar thing happening to her over on the self-published subreddit. And she said Amazon decided to recategorize her novel as erotica because it had explicit scenes, when that's not what defines the genre. And her work was very much not an erotica. As with the issue with the horror writer before, through emailing, someone, an actual human person, eventually read her book and determined that she was right. The mistake was corrected. It took multiple emails. They probably just trusted their system. She fought them on the definition of erotica itself. Taken all together, it seems as if there's maybe an automated level of content moderation that may take into account reader complaints and just trust that. That then leads to changes and removals. Sometimes talking to Amazon can rectify the issue. Sometimes it does not. Does that mean we are at the mercy of bots coming and looking for words? If certain material is acceptable in other genres because it does not aim to excite, then here's a question. What if bannable content occurs in an erotic piece that doesn't happen for the purpose of excitement? Take an erotic horror novel. If there is a death in that piece, but the death is not erotic in nature, does that qualify as snuff and become grounds for termination? Doesn't that sound pretty fucking stupid? It is. And because the bounds of what is and isn't erotica are actually incredibly blurry, you do find a lot of self-censorship going on in the self-publishing world in order to access Amazon's market and protect themselves from the insane levels of misthinking going on. Now, all the more power to the business-minded creatives who take that and run with it. That's kind of what you have to do. But why should that be the standard? It shouldn't. Here's another question. Why is some of that banned? For written work. There's no legal trouble for a story between an Omega Catboy magician and his jock werewolf alpha going at it after the spring formal at some generically named university. We'll get to it. And yes, it's about as dumb as you could imagine. Surely, if Amazon causes such frustrations and has those limits, obviously there has to be a competitor in the self-publishing arena that allows for more content. Right? Smashwords. When you're thinking of self-publishing written work for profit, after people talk your ear off about Amazon and KDP, they'll inevitably bring up one little massive competitor. Smashwords. Effectively, the self-publishing market, ebook-wise at least, is cornered by Smashwords and Amazon. Or rather, it kind of was, and a few years before that, there was a third contender, Draft to Digital. For several reasons, I'm sure, Draft to Digital and Smashwords, not too long ago, decided to join forces. D2D's acquisition of Smashwords was announced on the 8th of February 2022. In the FAQ section on a Smashwords post about the merger, they announced the policies for erotica. They announced the policies for erotica will follow Smashwords' existing guidelines, rather than forcing Smashwords authors to go by the previous, more restrictive standards of Draft to Digital. What are the Smashwords guidelines? Theoretically, almost anything goes, except And here we're going to do the stupid self-censoring thing again. You can't have chocolate, corpse maxing, or Annabelle Leeing. And yes, Edgar Allan Poe would be quite disappointed if he were a modern-day spicy writer. Let me spin a scenario for you. I was reading a manga called Madk, or M-A-D-K, by Ryo Suzuri. It's pretty hardcore. The main character summons a demon so he can feast on him like a zombie. He sells his soul, becomes that demon's underling in hell. There's a lot of death, scare quotes there, because most of these characters are immortal, kind of. If you stab someone who cannot die for a stab wound, are you intending to kill them? Is it a metaphor? What if your story is specifically about depravity, its causes, how you'd evolve through it, and how it intersects with power? Do those themes automatically make something immoral? No. Yes, it is available on Amazon because there are vast differences in how self-publishing is handled in regards to allowable content versus traditionally published art everywhere. But back to the manga itself. Is that what is called snuff? Mega question for you. Just like when we talked about the difference between erotic, erotica, romance, and romantic, what is snuff? We'll get to the metaphors of it later, but what qualifies something as the corpse maxing, oh no, we need to ban this subgenre? It is a slang word for murder. You know, you snuff someone's life out like you do a candle. But obviously that's not what's being banned, because you can have murder in the vast majority of books, films, and TV shows. It is a fairly popular plot point. So let's approach it as a genre. I think the first instinct is to turn where the term began as a type of art, film. No thinking hard about it, what would you call a snuff film? That's the question Sebastian Stoddard asked in this article for Collider. In it, he says that some people claim snuff films have to be pornographic in nature, while noting that the majority of people think it basically has nothing to do with sex. It's a film that depicts real murder. In her excellent concept album, Preacher's Daughter, Ethel Cain tells the story of a woman who was caught up in the machinations of a cult in her attempt to find love, eventually being murdered and cannibalized by a man. The song in which the character Ethel dies in the album is titled August Underground. It shares that title with a series of films by director Fred Vogel. I wasn't going around Googling the song title when I heard it until I watched the H.T. Hayes reaction to the album, and he was told it was a snuff film. Is it? No, it's a fictional horror movie. As Stoddard notes, part of the problem is people turn off their critical thinking skills when they watch things shot found footage style. Primed with the belief that snuff films already exist, if a found footage horror film gets that label, it sort of sticks. People think it's real for a long time, even though it's obviously not. In fact, it turns out the famous films that cause all of the moral panic around the genre are fictional. Not even Cannibal Holocaust depicts actual murder, despite what people thought, or may still think in some cases. Anecdotally, I've seen the label put on any video that depicts any actual death. When Aaron Bushnell committed suicide, the video going around on Twitter was described by those who didn't want to be forced to watch someone's death as a snuff film. Is it, though? Stoddard argues that none of these things are snuff films because, as widely thought about, snuff films don't exist. There's not evidence for them. They aren't merely videos depicting death. Otherwise, you'd get a whole bunch of complaints towards the news. I mean, there's a difference between a video and a film, after all. And those videos tend to be for propagandic or historic record-keeping purposes. These sorts of films have to showcase actual death as the point for profit. That's his definition, and I think it's the most correct. It may or may not have a sexual component. I think for the definition of snuff here, it has to be. He also notes that older definitions don't require reality to it, but the popular meaning of the word, which is, by the way, what words mean, what they are known to mean, requires that reality. So, a book. Can a book be a snuff book? Well, theoretically, there can be journals documenting the real details of murders committed by the person writing them, and if that person is a specific kind of sexual sadist who's publishing for profit, sure, I guess. But the publishing of that, will that ever exist outside propagandic or record-keeping purposes? I don't think so. Regardless, though, we're talking about fiction here. Can a fictional piece ever be true snuff? No. That removes a core part of the contemporary definition. But okay, when we're talking about censorship and guidelines of self-publishing, we're typically talking about erotica. So then the definition is massaged around a bit and transformed. They don't mean actual snuff because there is no real anything in a fictional book. That's not how fiction is. You would assume then that they mean death or the threat of death in an erotic context. And you would be wrong. On the erotica authors subreddit, one user detailed her experience with a book being banned for supposed snuff and what she learned through emailing with support over that ban. She bolded 2 important lines. These were her takeaways on Smashwords' guidelines. If any isolated scene in an erotica story makes it look like someone is killed or should have been killed by an intentional violent act, it's snuff, regardless of any other context. And you just can't depict extreme violence of any sort in an erotica piece in any context. You may think these are saying the same thing, but there is an important difference. The second statement takes away the intentional aspect of it. It also takes away the death aspect. Where then lies erotic horror? What happens when the definition of erotica is disagreed upon? If someone believes erotica is any writing with adult scenes aimed at titillation, though intention is hard to assign, then is a thriller novel about a serial killer wherein the lead detective happens to have a steamy scene, does that become a novel with bannable snuff because someone dies in it? How about an action novel that has erotic scenes? Alternatively, this opens up an entirely different realm of the subgenre. If someone dies peacefully of natural causes and that death excites the main characters, that doesn't seem to qualify under the communication she had with Smashwords. But isn't that more clearly the thing that they do not want in their erotic pieces? More so than an unconnected, unrelated scene of violence. If Smashwords were to classify that as snuff, are they likely to distinguish between that and, say, a scene at a funeral or afterwards, where, in part to process their emotions, the main characters sleep with their partner? I know that seems like maybe a facetious question, but I'm serious about it. And their guidelines, a handful of things that Amazon bans, Smashwords says they discourage and might ban your account for if you put too much of it out there. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Patreon. When you're looking around the internet these days on ways to make money off of the things you create, one of the first things people will suggest is drafting up a Patreon. Speaking of, like, comment, subscribe! So, when it comes to Patreon and NSFW, it is interesting derogatory. Dubcon and non-con are disallowed in any media, which means you're not allowed a sip of alcohol, hypnosis, Omegaverse. Consensual non-con is also a no-go. Actual pets are a no-go, but magical creatures... Sure. No family unless you're doing a Game of Thrones, specifically a Game of Thrones. No actual pornography unless you're drawing it, in which case congratulations to all the furries out there. It says you can do writing and audio too. No wage play. OnlyFans. The biggest Patreon-esque site for adult content creators is OnlyFans. If you've been around on gay Twitter, you've no doubt seen hundreds upon hundreds of links directing you to view their content over there. You go, guys, get that coin. You've probably also seen complaints about censorship over the years. The site came under heavy fire all the way back in 2021 when it announced plans to ban adult content that October. It was going to turn its back on the very users that constituted its backbone. Following massive outcry, they reversed course. Does that mean they're completely pro-adult content? No. Perhaps because of its amateur vibes, wanting to connect performers and creators to their users, you know, that kind of parasocial thing you get on any kind of content creation platform, they've stripped away the fictionality of porn. NSFW doesn't become film, erotica, art. It becomes only NSFW. Documentary. Because of that, things that would be frowned upon in real life must not be allowed. Before we go on, I want to posit something really quick that seems to evade a lot of people. What is filmed intercourse? What is erotica? It's art. It is expression. NSFW involves characters and a plot with a beginning, middle, and end. You might not think it's a complex plot, but it is a plot. It always, by its nature, says something about the nature of beauty and the state of being human. You see people making fun of old porn acting a lot. There's that, excellent Emma Stone sketch on SNL where she plays an extra on a gay set. It is very funny. But the performers are acting. It doesn't matter the quality. They're still acting. It's the same concept as when someone is performing an autobiographical solo show at a theater. They aren't merely being themselves, they are performing the character of themselves, and that's an important distinction. That's also assuming that's who the character in the film is. That's not true a lot of times. Actors in these sorts of films are generally improvisers working around predetermined scenarios or working off of an exact script at all times, working under restrictions and permissions. Their entire persona around it is more than likely a character. Erotica is also one of the oldest art forms. Grecian urns are covered in sex scenes. This fact seems to get lost a lot in the conversation over NSFW. People assume it's merely real life. That assumption ends up turning up a lot of these bans on content. For instance, a lot of the following restrictions on OnlyFans don't make a lick of sense if you think of the content posted as film and fiction. You can't show or refer to any sort of weaponry, so put your robbery and serial killer roleplay away. No drugs, so you can't have a drink or a cigarette together. And no drug paraphernalia, so if you forgot to put away your poppers or bong and they're deep in the background somewhere, oopsies, that's a content violation, even if it doesn't play into the content in any way, shape, or form. No family time, no pets, no violence, non-con, dub-com, heavy BDSM, filmed piercing, no hypno or pretending to be in the Omegaverse, no corpse maxing or Annabelle Lees, no playing about in pools or chocolate, which means any accidents have to be edited out, no being out in public, no playing at being a lady of the night or owned by anyone, no slurs of any sort. So if you like being called the F word in bed, not here you will, that's hate speech. I've seen people complain about content getting taken down for fake blood too. Too heavy a carrot gobble. It's good for your eyesight, In the OnlyFans advice subreddit, there are lists of words that are supposedly restricted use for the site. Some of them are sensible, some of them... Well, let's take the word jail, for instance. Assumedly, the reasoning behind the restriction is because it can have an association with dubcon and non-con. However, it's also just a part of slang, a word, your histories. Have you ever watched a Mike's Mike video where he yells, "Jail!" at something wild going on in whatever show or movie or he's talking about? Another is young. So of course that's due to not wanting, but also say you run a couples page. Does that mean you can't answer a question about who is younger and who is older? Here's the big kicker. Consent. Now let's imagine you want to make a video that is focused on how consent is both important and attractive, or educating on consent. The first guy I was ever in a long-term relationship with would always make sure to check in with me. He'd ask before we did anything new, and when it was no longer new, most of the time he still asked first. He wanted to make sure I was safe and happy and enjoying my time with him. Before we met, my previous encounters were of a, let's say, difficult nature. His natural sweetness and desire to check in with me was attractive. It was, on a level, romantic. And it was healing. I don't like the idea that I wouldn't be allowed to discuss any of that on that site. JustForFans. When creators get burnt out by OnlyFans, one of the most popular places for them to land is the similarly named JustForFans. Oh, I wonder where they arrived on that name. I appreciate their website not because I use it, but it does have a clearly stated list of prohibited content and prohibited words. They're specific. They say no pets, but they make clear they mean actual animals. Go be the trans cat girl and the whimpering pup boy you were always meant to be. Good on you. No asthma, let's say. Don't be bleeding unless it's your time of the month, but you're still not allowed to start crying tears of blood from hitting the Amaterasu. Naruto. Don't set yourself on fire. No cannibalism. Now that one's funny to me because obviously it's bad because that's illegal, but I think they mean you can't role play it as well, and you can't role play Vore stuff, but I'm not entirely sure. They might just mean don't do cannibalism. No drinking or drugs, but you can be a Hollywood character from pre-2000s and chain smoke till the end of time, so congrats if you're Aubrey Hepburn. No corpse maxing and no scary. No family. Though they clarify you can pretend to be family, so that's kind of funny in the same way the cannibalism thing is to me. It's a reasonable entry on that topic compared to most, but I'm enjoying their, hey, don't do actual illegal stuff stance. No non-con or dubcon play. So probably no Omegaverse. No stapling yourself, no water polo with others, and no drinking the pool, but you can play water polo by yourself, it looks like. No brownies and no naps. Don't go to sleep. No weapons, so a lot of parody porn of the past is out, which is still annoying. For their ban words, they ban all variations of those words too. Meet is on there, so you can't post a collab and be like, OMG, we finally met. Teen, for good reason, but the variation bit probably means adults of 18 and 19 aren't allowed to mention their age in any direct sort of way. Compared to other sites, I really like the transparency here and the relative laxness with their restrictions compared to other places. After Gumroad kicked out NSFW artists, JFF went all, hi friends, come use us. We're willing to create new features as you need them. We just made a way of hosting and selling art on the site. Please. And honestly, good for them. According to a Reddit thread in Erotica Authors, they're trying to figure out if their payment processor is going to make them restrict the same things they have to restrict for actual people doing things to each other when it comes to written erotica. So, not entirely sure there yet, at least as of recording when I checked their site. Tumblr. Y'all remember when Tumblr turned around and banned NSFW content, right? It's not just me. Plenty of people fled the site. You had a bunch of people try to make replacement sites. There was Tumbex and New Tumble and BDSMler, which I think is the only successful version to come out of all of that. Is NSFW off Tumblr? No, not at all. Does it regularly get taken down with people making new profiles and posting it all over again? Yes, it's a Groundhog Day situation over there. Is it filled with erotica on GIFs and pics that don't technically break the rules? Yeah, obviously. You may recall one of the bits that annoyed most people was the restriction specifically on female presenting nipples. They were banned, whilst male presenting nipples were not, which goes to show that this sort of censorship is also determined by cultural biases. There is a sexist double standard at play. Got a question for you. Why does Tumblr not crack down as hard on erotica as it does on visual posts? I think part of it is the difference in liability. Posts with bare bodies have a higher chance of copyright infringement, revenge posting, or being illegal sorts of posting. Erotica has a drastically smaller chance of being any of those things. So why are there restrictions on erotica on publishing sites that are stricter than on Tumblr? We'll get there. Florida. It's one thing to talk about social media, video hosting sites, and publishers, but the current urge for censorship obviously does not end there. You might cast your mind through recent news stories and think, wait, wasn't there a recent win on the Florida Don't Say Gay front? There was a lawsuit and a settlement, and everyone involved seemed happy at the result. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that. I'm not so sure I see it as a complete win. According to this transcript of NPR's Morning Edition, the lawsuit clarifies that disgustingly vague language of the law that was written specifically to have this deniable plausibility while inflicting maximum pain before a ruling such as this. More importantly, it still bans instructions on LGBT people. So the gay civil rights movement cannot be discussed in history classes. Neither can the AIDS epidemic, not in any meaningful way at least. Characters can be gay in books, but any books taught with gay characters cannot have that as a central theme to either the characters or the book. What does that mean exactly? What does a character having their romantic relationship being a theme in a children's book mean? Oftentimes that just means having a romantic relationship. Assumedly, that means the teacher also cannot discuss that aspect of the characters at all. It also means discussion of queer healths in sex ed remains unavailable, in part because they don't want sex ed to exist. In fact, in this Metro Weekly article, it claims that when teachers are allowed to discuss queer people through non-instructional moments, they have to be neutral. At the same time, it doesn't prohibit intervention against anti-queer bullying. 1 + 1 equals How do you intervene there without making any statements of moral or ethical judgment? It's wrong to bully your classmates for being gay. Well, no, because you have to be neutral. So you can say, it's wrong to bully your classmate. And if they reply, we're not bullying, we're warning them about how wrong it is to be gay. What's their response? If you correctly call that bullying, aren't you making a non-neutral statement? Now you might say, I'm not being particularly kind in my interpretation of this settlement or the law or the intentions of the people behind it or how it will be implemented. Unfortunately, Florida is the one who passed the shit law. They deserve it. Books are allowed to be in the library, but you're not allowed to teach them. That sounds like censorship. Still. Now, why am I talking about that in a video on NSFW censorship? These are obviously separate issues. Except, you can only view them as separate if you're not a homophobic, transphobic bigot operating out of bad faith, which eliminates the politicians in Florida. When people decry the social contagion of mentioning queerness around children, the assumption is that all queerness is inherently sexual at all times. It is inherently not safe for work by its very nature. So I want to ask you, when these people are busy talking about restricting NSFW on the internet, in libraries, in media, do they mean what they say? Do they mean what you think of when you think NSFW? Do they actually care about supporting what they claim they support? No, they don't. 2, concerned condemnation. So what are some of those supposed reasons people want to ban and censor things in creative fields, especially when it comes to NSFW content? You'll get evangelical types talking about sin and ascetics, sure, but they'll also feign medical concern for porn addiction. You have swerfs talking about exploitation. People will bring up sexism and the impacts of fiction. And of course, the go-to, but what about the children? And I want to take their concerns seriously, because I think most of them are mostly stupid, and I want to lay out how. Addiction. In my video over gay readings of the video game Genshin Impact, we asked if so-called behavioral addictions are real or not. What are behavioral addictions? Well, in regards to that video, gaming. Then, most everyone can rattle off porn, sex, and gambling. Go watch that section of the video. No, do it. We'll wait. For those of you who didn't go do that, are those addictions real? No. Okay, to be a little more nuanced, it's hotly debated. Is gaming addiction a real disorder? Maybe. Is it caused by games? Almost definitely not. So-called gaming addiction is likely an expression of an actual condition like a struggle with impulse control or depression. As I mentioned in the Genshin video, when a Chinese state newspaper did its whole gaming is opium lie, they cited a child who specifically said he enjoyed gaming because it gave him a sense of fulfillment. The obvious conclusion there is not that gaming is bad, that he was experiencing some form of depression that prevented him from feeling successful, content, or happy. He was unfulfilled. And based on the response of his father, my guess is that part of that is from a lightly abusive home environment. So in my opinion, gaming addiction is largely bullshit. Besides the evidence not necessarily being there, the suggestion that it might exist, as with China, can easily lead to exaggeration, legislation, and restriction. If you call gaming an opioid for the soul, why then you can crack down on the industry however you so like. Wow, I'm being so subtle in suggesting that people who pretend erotic addictions are real might actually be after something else. A Time article quotes sex therapist Dobron Harvey as saying, "People can have sexual behavior that feel very much uncontrollable, and those feelings should be taken seriously by health professionals. But it's way too premature to call that an addiction or a psychiatric disorder." That same article says, "Several studies have found that people who are what clinicians call hyposexual do not display the symptoms of addiction." The UK's NHS has a page answering someone's question of, can you become addicted to sex with who knows? Which, great, very helpful, guys, thank you. But I bring up the NHS post because It's another case of a health organization taking something people insist is real and pointing out that, oh, well, the evidence isn't entirely there. But surely, given all the fear-mongering about it, porn addiction is real, right? I mean, you see comments about it all the time. When someone makes a joke on Twitter about something non-sexual being sexual, people roll their eyes and call them porn-brained. The common response to gay Twitter accounts wading into politics on their alts is someone calling them an addict. The charge gets lobbied at OnlyFans creators all the time. Now, obviously, none of that is a real concern over a potential addiction to anything. The addiction isn't real. The urge is to call someone oversexed so everyone else can feign disgust and sun them because sex is icky. It's an attempt to stamp a scarlet letter. But because the charge gets thrown out all the time, surely it is a thing that exists, right? Wrong. Business Insider paraphrases Dr. Nicole Prouse as saying, "People who struggle with the pornography viewing almost always have an underlying disorder, most commonly depression, that requires treatment." Pushing this false idea of addiction, she claims, is delaying actual research and actual treatments. It's theater. As the article says, people's cultural, moral, or religious beliefs may lead them to believe they are addicted to pornography, even if they don't actually watch a lot of porn. Noted Shakespearean weird sisters Girl Define talk about so-called porn addiction on their website. They spin a made-up story about a woman who loves chocolate bars accidentally eating mud in a way that confuses addiction with delusion and psychosis. Bethany Beale says, "In the end, you find yourself feeling disgusted by what you did, and at the very same time, strangely craving for more. Post-nut clarity, Bethany. Sometimes that causes shame, often because of purity culture." According to recent research, it's estimated that 9.4 million women access adult pornography websites every single month. Girls of all ages are finding themselves enslaved to pornography with no power to escape. What research is that, you might ask? Who knows? They don't cite anything. Good job. It's easy to wonder then, does their data point about 9.4 million women every month mean it's each woman accessing every single month, or the amount of women total in a month? Does it account for people who access those sites multiple times? Does it count clicking through to find a video as one visit, or each page as a different visit? If someone's jumping between sites to try to find something, that's probably separate visits. Where is it localized to? Is it the whole globe? Because there are billions of people who exist. No one knows because they don't cite anything. But my guess is that they're conflating any consumption with full-on addiction. Also, monthly does not an addiction make. Their solution? Well, their version of Christianity, of course. Is the concern actually supposed addiction that doesn't actually exist, or is it a way to push their religious beliefs? In a yelling into a microphone video where the two sisters call purity culture bad before going on about how purity culture is fine and reading romance novels is bad for you, they do actually have a couple of decent points. Shocking, I know. The two sisters mention how part of the issue with sexual struggles is the silence fueled by shame. Talking about your struggles is always an important step in dealing with them, no matter what they're about. Naming something lets you have power over it. They also point out that marriage is not going to suddenly curtail all of your desire. Now, they mean that in a having desires is because of sin, evangelical nonsense sort of way, but there is a point there. Having a partner does not suddenly make you entirely partner sexual, just like marriage isn't going to cure your depression. Kristen partially blames porn for the horrible, uncommon, shocking moment of fantasizing while being intimate with her husband. I know, the horrors. In that, they advertise a free PDF that you have to give them your email to view, so of course I made up a fake mail.com account and read through it. In a section called Consequences of watching pornography. They say, on a neurological level, porn is short-circuiting your brain and emotions. Therefore, the normal everyday pleasures and connections you have start to become less and less satisfying. That's, of course, comparing porn to substance addictions. Is the evidence there to support any of what they just said? No, of course not. They don't go as far as suggesting legal political remedies for this, but equating the erotic to substance abuse draws an implicit political conclusion, like hard drugs. According to WSBT in Michigan, Brandywine's school board aimed to tackle the totally real phenomenon of porn addiction at a meeting discussing banning books from school libraries. WVPE says of that same school board that the video they played in that meeting insinuated that the school library contains pornography. In that WVPE article, Debbie McCullough of the Michigan Library Association points out that most of the books being challenged are books that deal with racism or have LGBTQ characters. In other words, the scary specter of addiction is being used as an excuse to attempt to put a don't say gaying on public education. So of course I watched the video they played at the meeting. Guess what I did? That's right, it lied and claim that pornography functions as an addictive substance that can cause you to get high. Does it? No! One interviewee claims it is as destructive, if not more so, than other even hard drugs. Is that true? No! It's entirely untethered to reality! What else does the video do? It implies that porn creates child sex offenders and zoophiles in and of itself. One woman blames it for the abuse that she faced. They blame sexual violence on erotic content. The argument is that viewing NSFW content is a gateway drug to illegal activity. Is that true? No! The last statement is that adult erotic content should be banned. That's the video's takeaway. So it's a series of lies meant to push for censorship. Given how the school board attempted to use this video to push a ban on books containing LGBT characters, how drag is considered NSFW in conservative circles, how gay people are called groomers for just existing, it becomes clear. The addiction framework paints an easy route to enforcing the closet on queer people. That's one of the very explicit goals. Exploitation. In her film Pornland, anti-porn feminist Gail Dines apparently says, "There has always been pornography, but there has not always been a porn industry." At least that's how Julie Bindel quotes her in an opinion piece for The Guardian. Bindel is maybe most famous for being a TERF, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, which is a fancy way of saying transphobic bigot. As made clear in this article, Bindel is also what's known as a SWORF, a sex worker exclusionary feminist. In an article for the Journal of Feminist Scholarship, SWORF Necropolitics, Aaron Haas claims SWORFs believe the transactional nature of sex work renders consent impossible or instantly revocable and unnecessary for the labor. The capitalist labor reality of the work part decides that buyers of sex have agency and sellers are reduced to non-agental bodies. He later says, beyond evacuating bodily autonomy, Swarfism mistranslates sex for compensation as inherently outside definitions of valid labor. While sex work is generally thought of as prostitution, it does include all forms such as porn actors. So if the view is that any form of sex work is exploitative in a capitalist sense, does the same hold true for erotica? Well, Swarfs do tend to be against erotica from my understanding, but it doesn't necessarily have the capitalist exploitation argument, so let's put a pin in that. Okay, why would NSFW with real people be bad under capitalism according to Swarfs? Let's ignore anti-sex feminists. They're not much relevant to the conversation or life in general, and there's no real need to examine their abolish sex goal because it's insane and impossible and dumb. That lack of consent Hamas talks about means the presence of capital itself makes any and all sex work non-con. The presence of money, apparently, makes it automatically coercive. After all, money is needed to survive. If it weren't for the money, perhaps there would be no intercourse partaken. There are people, yes, who turn to such work as a last resort or don't enjoy it or were forced into it. But there are also plenty who willingly do it as labor because it is work. And either they're good at it and don't mind it, or plot twist, they actually enjoy it. But their opinions don't matter to Swerfs, definitionally. You might have heard so-called pure teens talk about how sex scenes in film and TV are also inherently exploitative. They remove the agencies of actors completely. Now, yes, of course, there are issues in media. Yes, the entertainment and porn industries deserve critique and examination. I am not arguing elsewise. There is a lot of bad in this world, unfortunately. Now, if anti-capitalism, though, is the driving force of Swerfism, what be of China? China's communist, right? The same labor capital exploitations don't exist there, so surely sex work and pornography must be fine, right? Well, prostitution is still illegal in China, so is porn, both the creation and consumption of it. So is capitalism not the source of the supposed evils of NSFW? I mean, China isn't actually communist or even leftist. It's a homophobic and sexist entity with authoritarian tendencies. Sorry, Tankies, you are wrong. The Human Rights Campaign links to an article by Graham Reed in The Hill, which talks about how China uses its supposed concern for the health of its young citizens to ban harmful and vulgar content. In practice, that's an excuse to crack down on gay media. But back to capital. Women on live streaming sites figured out that they made more money by using their sex appeal. Shocking, I know. According to this Vox article, China went after a bunch of live streaming sites, supposedly because of that phenomenon. But the article argues that really, it was just a move to consolidate capital under companies the government has a history of cooperation and goodwill with. Sounds like state capitalism to me. Is porn legal in Cuba? Well, you're not allowed to make or distribute erotic material in Cuba. So if it's wrong because of capital, surely it should be legal and fine to make in Cuba. When you ask some of these people who are supposedly leftists if there will be porn in the post-revolution state, you probably won't be surprised that they say there won't be. And there won't be because there's not going to be a revolution. It sounds then like labor exploitation isn't the real issue. They want a blanket ban and censorship. They just don't want to be called conservatives. Oftentimes, it's to push a puritanical worldview and increase restrictions on citizens. That's the goal. Sexism. Another concern of Swerfs, of course, is sexism. A lot of porn is violent. A lot of language around NSFW includes violent words. Slam, force, gag, impale. Think of the reactions to 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight. A lot of romance and erotica plays into damsel in distress storylines. There are brooding alpha males who are often emotionally abusive and domineering in some way. They are dangerous. And it seems like the female main characters are kind of into this. It's teaching our daughters to accept bad behavior, is a criticism some parents had of Twilight. In her article for The Guardian, Julie Bindel says of her concerns, there are real women in pornography, and whether the violence is acted out or real, the message is that brutality equals sexual pleasure. Rather than look for a direct causal link between viewing porn and sexual violence, we should be looking at the culture of misogyny that porn arises from and contributes to. And I think that's a pretty interesting statement. There is for sure a certain misogynistic violence to contemporary erotic material. There's a certain misogynistic violence to the erotic in general. But Bindel's suggestion of shrugging off investigations into links between viewing NSFW and increased violence seems out of place to me. While I understand the argument that she's making, that it's wrong independent of its outcomes because of the systems it exists in and perpetuates, wouldn't it be better for the argument and the prescription of censorship to investigate and establish such a connection if it exists? I almost wonder if she's afraid that the link doesn't actually exist, or if it does, that the effect is minute enough to not matter to anyone. She thinks the world would be better off without specifically real-life heterosexual porn, but based on her acted out or real bit I don't think it's a risky bet to say she's likely also against erotica. A lot of sexuality itself is violent. If that is inherently bad, then its perpetuation in any NSFW context is also bad. In an article for Unheard, Bendel goes after lesbians who practice BDSM. She says, buying into the misogynistic myths that women love to be hurt and humiliated during sex, that pain is erotic, that pleasure can be derived from the steel-capped boot on the neck, is nothing short of capitulating to patriarchy. Fun fact, in the same article she does do some casual reactionary queerphobia with the alphabet soup joke for the LGBTQIA acronym. Love that. So yeah, she's a bigot. Her feminism is anti-trans, anti-sex, and seemingly anti-queer. Isn't that great? It's almost like she's a conservative reactionary and not on the left at all. But it does lead me to wonder, how would she write about the topic in terms of female doms? How about gay male partnerships with BDSM elements? If a twink likes putting a leash on a cub, are they doing misogyny in her mind? Logically, no. If sexuality is misogynistic violence, then in gay male couples, sexuality can rarely ever include that label. Unless, of course, you think one of the men is the woman, in which case you're just a homophobe. But if it's not, then such kinks are only bad when women engage in them, which seems like a denial of agency for women, at which point, you are doing misogyny yourself. I know I'm building a bit of a straw man here, but I am kind of curious. There's this quote from the video Envy by ContraPoints that has stuck with me ever since I first watched it. She says, when you make loving your body into... No, I'm gonna give her a British accent. When you make loving your body into a moral imperative, not only are you still going to hate your body, but you're also going to feel guilty about hating your body because it makes you a bad feminist. I want to take that quote and think about it in terms of desire and Bendel's assertion that desire for a masochistic experience is immoral. If you make changing your desires into a moral imperative, not only are you going to have those same desires, but you're also going to feel shame about desire because it makes you a bad feminist. You cannot shame spiral your way out of pretty much anything. Shame is the mind killer. So shamelessly put your hand in the box. Part of the video played at the Brandywine School Board meeting paints their anti-porn crusade as partially fueled by concern for women. A section title for the video says, "Pornography demeans women." That video was published by Family Watch International. So of course I went digging to look for their feminist credentials that they totally have. The hate organization's website is predictably anti-queer. It's against gay marriage and transitioning. As well, it supports conversion therapy. Queer issues are feminist issues, so there's one strike. They're against abortion, so there's a second strike. And they're also opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment. Strike 3. Isn't it so fun that a group that advocates for conversion torture had a propaganda film played by a government entity in order to encourage censorship of books with queer themes? I wonder what the goals of this supposedly feminist group are. They're so hard to figure out. They sure don't taste like feminism. On their policy page, they say, research so shows that mothers and fathers by nature of their genders make unique contributions as part of their argument against gay marriage and adoption. And yes, of course, it's also implicitly a screed against single parents, which includes single mothers, which, yes, is bad. So that's biological essentialism, which is sexism. Of erotica, noted hate group that is disturbingly influential in US politics, Focus on the Family, says, supporting the genre supports the objectification of women and sex. They know why women like erotica, though. It's because they long to submit to a strong man. They want to be a biblical woman. That's what women were made for, after all. Did I mention that they're a hate group? Because they are. But okay, let's actually consider the point. A lot of erotic art is centered around images of submission and domination. Homoeroticism is often defined around sport and violence. As Dan McClellan talks about in his examinations of the Clobber passages and current use of them for anti-queer bigotry, the assumptions of the ancient world were that sex itself is about power. Think of it as a food chain. The penetrating person is at the top of the food chain. They are the human. The penetrated partner is the beast, capable of being hunted, owned, and tamed. For the beast to climb the food chain is death for humanity. For a man to lie with another man is to make him non-human. Yes, the entire concept is incredibly stupid and sexist, and the concepts of thousands of years ago probably aren't great and don't maybe translate well into our current understanding, so maybe chill out, everyone. Maybe just chill out. But if we take that conceptualization of sex as the expression of power and ownership, then all heterosexual NSFW material becomes another grain of sand on the scale that is male domination over women. The erotic, then, is by nature death. For a man to take a woman for their viewing pleasure of another is to kill her. It's to make a snuff film. Yes, that is incredibly sexist. But in a sexist culture where women often aren't treated as fully human by their male counterparts, there is some there. Women are often treated as the object, as the tameable beast. While putting it in such terms is upsetting to hear, the vague idea of biblical sexual dynamics does continue. It does have something to say. Sex as a showcase of power fuels a lot of violence. So if we think media has any effect on those watching it, we have to consider the idea that NSFW work that portrays power differentials of any sort play into that culture of violence. And there is no interesting video of any sorts without changing dynamics. Even in the equality of yin-yang, our brain's gonna place one on top of the other. Here's an odd quote from New York Times opinion columnist Michelle Goldberg. "There have been growing signs of young women rebelling against a culture that praises utilizations over empathy and responsibility." She then goes on to misrepresent demisexuality as an aversion to casual sex, when that's not really what that term means. Anywho, her article discusses this idea that some young people have felt pressured to be into certain activities because they see it in erotic material. There are men supposedly getting away with cruelty in the name of sexual liberation, and well, yeah. As a person attracted to men, we often suck. My automatic response to the article is that these are young people. You're going to feel pressured by every aspect of pretty much everything, because that is what it means to be young and figuring out who you are when you, say the line with me, live in a society. Goldberg's article explains that to some people, the embrace of sex is patriarchal male gazing. The male gaze is often critiqued in visual media nowadays. If you're my age, you'll remember all the criticisms toward armor designs in games and movies that didn't seem at all practical, but instead designed to be sexy. Nowadays, you'll find the inverse of that conversation, with a lot of incels complaining about female characters not being their type and not being hot enough and therefore mannish, because the worst thing for an incel is for a woman to not be a pet. It's still a hotly contested issue in manga and anime too. Fan service often goes over the top. I'm sure there are plenty of women out there who have been pushed away from these mediums because of the intense sexualization. But is all of that feminism, or is some of it conservatism trying to do entryism on an intimate subject that makes people uncomfortable? I think almost everything is open to critique and examination, but as an artist who loves art, I am vastly more critical of any instinct to censor art. In their reviews of the 50 Shades trilogy, both Jenny Nicholson and Dan Olson of Floating Ideas point out how Christian becomes unsexed as the movies go on. The first film had a female writer and director. The next two were done by men. Transitioning from the female gaze to the male gaze lost a lot of their eroticism. He became what straight men think women find sexy. In desexing him, some of the equality is lost. I know that might seem odd to say about a BDSM series that a lot of people do not like for good reasons, but think about it. My understanding, based on the reviews I've seen, is that 50 Shades follows a slow trajectory of Anna gaining power over Christian. The dynamic shifts, but that only works if both of them are eroticized. To steal the sexual gaze on him is to rob him of his vulnerability. He stops becoming a participant and becomes a creature inflicting eroticism on his female counterpart. No longer can the dynamic change because he isn't truly part of the dynamic. It's only Anna and what is done to her. I would guess that makes for a vastly more uncomfortable viewing experience. If the sequels were women-led, would it feel even a little bit less sexist to people? I'd wager yes. I'm not going to entertain anti-sex ideologies because they're dumb and unrealistic. Sex can be very important to some people and can be a non-factor for others. Neither of those things has any moral positioning relative to the other. But in their concern for the ways women continue to be harmed, why is the push to de-sex art, to ban pornography? If the conflict is feeling pressure from these media to do things you might not want, isn't the obvious solution to simply speak up and not do these things you don't want to do? You have to be your own advocate. If you can't handle that, how does that become the fault of the existence of art? Ascetics. I saw recently a joking tweet comparing Catholicism to Protestantism. It went something along the lines of, Protestants think pleasure is bad. Catholics think suffering is good. A piece of lore about me I bring up every now and then is my experience with Catholics while I was in college. One of the friends I had made my freshman year eventually became an anti-gay Catholic. She dropped out to go be a nun. Good for her, I guess. Before she left, we had a long conversation in my car that caused both of us to cry a lot and absolutely ended our friendship. In it, we talked about how joyful she often seemed and how I loved that for her, how I was a little bit jealous of it. My mental health issues were well known to anyone who was around me. She told me that I could be happy too, if only I was Catholic. That was my problem, not being Catholic. Of course, the conversation started because I confronted her about some gay friends I had who she was counseling to be celibate. To make a very long rant short, Catholics think being gay is being broken to a degree, but it's totally fine as long as you're celibate. No love for you. It's just homophobia. Given that context, what she was saying here had an additional layer. Part of your unhappiness comes from being a gay man. If you repressed your desires for love and intimacy, you might be happy. Self-denial is holy. During that same conversation, we were talking about suffering. I think that I brought it up as part of the obvious explanation of the bad fruit of non-affirming theology. It causes immense suffering, and suffering is not holy. She disagreed. To her, perhaps because of the Passion of the Christ, a terrible movie, suffering was holy. Part of the moment that caused the struggle with my gay friends was a masculinity program that ran at the local Catholic ministry. This is anecdotal, as there's not much that my Googling managed to scrounge up, and I wasn't about to pay a bunch of money for some Catholics to tell me to take cold showers and be a more manly man. Exodus 90 is a masculinity program that aims to encourage asceticism. One of my friends, after starting the program, broke up with his boyfriend and decided to become chaste. Is that connected? One article on their website reads, "We encourage chaste and proper marital relationships between a monogamous married man and woman." Catholics being anti-gay isn't a surprise given their homophobic catechism, but that statement combined with the negative effects I observed it having on my friends, well, eventually I found this companion document called the Exodus Bride by a group called Endow, meant for the wives of men partaking in Exodus 90. On page 4 it reads, "In engaging in Exodus 90, your husband is attempting to restore this unity. Through prayer, the foundation of his exercises, he will ask God for the grace to heal his own disordered desires. Through the ascetical practices, he has a concrete plan for establishing discipline in his life." As the Catholic Catechism reads, "The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. This inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial." It calls it a condition and then says, "Homosexual persons are called to chastity by the virtues of self-mastery that teach them inner freedom, at times by the support of disinterested friendship, by prayer and sacramental grace. They can and should gradually resolutely approach Christian perfection. Notice the use of disordered in both the Endow pamphlet and the Catechism. And also note that it kind of implies that you can heal being gay if you're a good holy person. In an interview with Spoken Bride, Exodus 90 founder James Baxter says, "I know that freedom is a cultural buzzword and thrown around to justify everything from sexual exploits to abortion." I'm guessing he means queerness by sexual exploits. I know that's an uncharitable reading, but I'm not really keen to give charity to programs that hurt people I love. More importantly, he says, "Here are my recommendations regarding chastity. First, start today. All virtues are dispositions or habits towards the good. Identify your triggers, take control of your glances, use your screens only for work or school. This will make the chastity of your future married selves much easier." I can't help but consider all of this together and wonder if the program, when at my college specifically, targeted young queer men in order to show them how much better their lives would be if they gave in to homophobic interpretations of the Bible. That's why my one friend broke up with his boyfriend. I had another who was heavily struggling with his sexuality at the time. He loved the idea of the program. We talked about it briefly and it made me deeply uncomfortable. And, you guessed it, the founder of the program claims that it helps with porn addiction, a thing that doesn't exist. Exodus 90 is based around the concept of asceticism. As they say on their website where they supposedly lay out how it works, asceticism means acts of self-denial. Baxter says, "For asceticism, a big part of what makes Exodus 90 so hard is the constant self-denial, and we ask that men don't modify the regimen to them, but bend themselves to it." Practically what this means is cutting out most of the world. You're not allowed to partake in art. You should stay off your phone. Texting has to be essential, so if you have friends who you mostly communicate with via text, they probably want you to cut them off for 90 days. No sweets, so if someone gives you a gift, you have to be antisocial and tell them, nah. No sports, etc., etc. A lot of it actually hinges on being kind of antisocial outside of the others partaking, and fasting and cold showers. Why cold? If it's about denial, wouldn't the idea be that you can't have a hot shower? That doesn't then mean that you have to be taking a cold shower. It could be a lukewarm. As one of my friends who partook said, the cold is the point because it sucks. Cold showers can be painful. They're not fun. They're a small form of suffering, and suffering is supposedly good. So it's not even self-denial. It's self-inflicted suffering. And so back to that comparison between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants think joy is bad. Catholics think suffering is good. Either road, where do you wind up? A weird form of ascetics. Have you heard the stereotype that Christians think being of the world is bad? That often includes much of culture. You have to deny it. To indulge is a sin. I found this thought process is not really restrained to religious thought at all. Let's go back for a brief moment to the so-called Puritan phenomenon, something Michelle Goldberg was touching on in her article. In an article for Vanity Fair, Richard Larson writes about sex scenes in movies. He spends a while going over the issues with exploitation and the thankful rise of NMC coordinators in the field. They're growing in theater too, which is good. Please, more of this. He says that is a popular idea, popular on corners of the internet anyway, that sex scenes are unnecessary relics from a horny pre-internet porn age, that they are distractions and cheats and sweaty indulgences that really have outlived their usefulness in the art of filmmaking. I don't know what voice that was. The article was prompted off of his viewing of the film Passages and his reaction to watching a long sex scene in a room filled with old straight white dudes. Uncomfortable. Yeah. He goes on to say, the scene probably didn't need to be so long and graphic, though what does need even mean when we're talking about film or any other subjective expression? By some metric, the scene is unnecessary. But by so many more, chiefly that it's what the filmmaker wanted to do, Passages wouldn't be Passages without it. The lines of thought about what's necessary and what's indulgent, like they're different things, are reminiscent of the thoughts behind Exodus 90. Indulgence is next to sin. Self-denial, apparently, is how you make supposedly good art, a thing that's totally real. Isn't indulgence all of art, though? One could argue that Tarantino's famous foot shots are not essential to the story of his films, but clearly the director is imbuing his work with his own interests, fixations, and eccentricities, as any good artist should, says Danny DiPlacido in Forbes. When I watched the excellently weird sex film Infinity Pool by Brandon Cronenberg, I thought several of the nature shots towards the start of the film were kind of unnecessary. I'm not personally a fan of those sorts of establishing or transitional shots in most movies unless they're like breathtakingly gorgeous or something, but they were a part of the story the filmmaker wanted to tell, and that's what I care about. This is self-indulgent is one of the single most useless criticisms I think anyone can have for a piece of art. Actually, I think it's next to useless in an even worse category: destructive. I read an article on Flavor Wire about the very concept of self-indulgent art by Judy Berman that eviscerates some of the most insanely annoying, stupid advice you ever hear about artists and arts careers. She says, "Don't write unless you can't do anything else," writers often say, by which they mean to convey that their work is such a punishing struggle that were they not conscripted by the gods, they would have bailed. This statement is a cover meant to absolve writers of the responsibility for their choice of profession, the deep desire to write. But there's no need for such a cover. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be an artist, because the want is meaningful and pleasurable. And she's right. You see that same sort of "don't do it if you can't," or "want to do anything else," in pretty much every art form. Actors say it, composers say it, painters, filmmakers, dancers, and it's a bullshit line each and every single time. Don't do it because you have to, do it because you want to. That's the good reason. But that last line of hers points clearly to why people employ advice like that. The work is meaningful and pleasurable. If you're an asceticist, the pleasure aspect is problematic. Pleasure is not holy. The denial of it is. Suffering is. The artist must be starving because that's the only way for them to be pure. They must be consumed with need and not want, because otherwise they are not pure, they are filthy. They must cut out anything not deemed necessary, because elsewise they are a sinner. As Berman says at the end of her article, but there is an element of indulgence in even the art that isn't called indulgent, if it's any good, because in art, this is the only work really worth doing. How often have you heard the true but joking observation that a moment in a film or a TV show is the writer's barely disguised fetish? It's a fun thing to point out and observe, and important for criticism a lot of times, especially in certain areas and productions. But most of the time, it's just an observation. Think of one of the most popular franchises of all time, Dragon Ball, by the late Akira Toriyama. From the beginning, there is an obsession with consumption and food. In the sequel series Dragon Ball Z, several of the villains literally eat their opponents, and the good guys are turned into food. The good guys also merge together. That's all an evolution of the eating obsession. It is self-indulgent, and it's compelling work. You know, obviously, given how insanely popular Dragon Ball has been for a long time, all flat the globe, Toriyama was indulgent in making it. I see advice against indulgence in a lot of writing spaces I'm in too. Have you ever heard of the insistence that writers slave over every single word? That's just not true. But why do we insist on it? I think it goes back to what Barnes said. It turns creation into struggle. Struggle is holy. Struggle removes the pleasure and selfishness of creating, because we've determined that all selfishness is inherently evil, and it's a stupid game we're playing. Do you have to weigh every individual word? No. In playwriting circles, I've seen people continuously argue over what lines have to do. They have to move plot or character. Some say they can push theme or world building, but otherwise they shouldn't be there. Everything should push a reason for its existence. You have to make an argument, and I categorically reject that. Kill your darlings is good advice, but only if you wanna. Yes, edit and revise and sharpen and make the best work that you can, but the best work for are you. No one can tell you what that is. Only you can. I want to see the colors of your soul. What you should cut out is the stuff you put in there for other people. So when people are concerned about indulgence with the use of sex and other less than work-safe material in scenes and art, what are they actually concerned with? The quality of art? Obviously not, especially since there is no such thing as objectively good or bad when it comes to art. It's pleasure. They think pleasure is wrong, and unfortunately, I don't think that viewpoint deserves any respect, and I certainly don't think it's a reason to start censoring art. Try again. Protection. The main concern that a lot of people pretend to have when they look to rid the world of NSFW content is the protection of children. That video put out by hate group Family Watch International is framed around the idea of protecting kids. The school board that played the propaganda was using it to defend censoring books with LGBT characters out of a pretend defense of children. When Anita Bryant was on her, "Oh my god, you guys making it illegal to discriminate against the gays is going to hurt my children" nonsense, she liked to pretend her operation was in the defense of kids. As she's well known for saying, homosexuals cannot reproduce, so they must recruit. And to freshen their ranks, they must recruit the youth of America. Social contagion. That's the idea that fueled Britain's failed and disastrous Section 28, that, as Abigail Thorne of Philosophy Tube said, negatively affected her because she didn't know that being herself was even an option for the longest time. That was kind of the point. As I pointed out in my video over Don't Say Gay and the vast homophobia of the Republican Party, that's the actual goal for at least one of the crafters of that bill. He wanted kids forced back into the closet. The drag ban bills pretend to be protecting children from inappropriateness, but that's not accurate to drag as an art form. It is not all one anything. That too is just a smokescreen to get rid of queer people. That's important to keep in mind when talking about attempts to censor art and NSFW content in general. Republicans often use that as a smokescreen in order to go after anyone who doesn't fall in line with their sexist version of Christianity. Think of uniform policies in schools that prevent students from having dyed hair or piercings while pretending it's about preserving the standard of education and professionalism, when in reality it's about control and making sure no one deviates too far from the norm. A kid having dyed hair isn't going to throw off education. Pornhub recently disabled its usage in several states across the United States due to age verification laws that have been passed, requiring users to prove they're above the age of 18 to access the sites. No, that doesn't mean clicking the "yes, I promise I'm old enough" button, but providing government IDs or something along those lines. Here's a question for you. Given that they're required at threat of lawsuit and fines, if adult websites were to abide by the law, logically, would they not have to keep records of compliance? If they were to keep records of compliance, would that require them to log every instance of someone using the site? Would you have to provide it when creating an account? Or if you have an account, would you have to provide your ID every single time that you visit the website? If it's to create a login, doesn't that theoretically mean all a minor needs to do is copy down the info on their parent's license a total of once? So then logically, shouldn't you be forced to provide ID every time of access? That seems like an undue burden to me, but let's say that you do. And let's say these same lawmakers are the sort who pretend porn addiction is real. Suddenly, you have a database you can access to attach legal names to a supposed addiction. And quite likely, a way to monitor individual interest in specific content. Someone likes step stuff, and suddenly they're a brand of ladders in the news. When these porn sites are inevitably hacked in the future, those IDs are prime blackmail material. Let's say someone's identity gets stolen. Your license might be used to access the most depraved things that could legally be found online, and then your documentation would be attached to them. Other methods for this prove how old you are facial ID scans, which sounds dumb, as some people look quite young and some people look quite old for their age. Or you could provide banking info, but if you have to share your banking info, oftentimes a credit card, what happens when the credit card companies despise NSFW content? For instance, PayPal doesn't let you use it to buy an SFW online or to get paid for it. We'll get into it later over credit card companies, but what if your bank or the credit card company frowns on certain usage? What if they decide to monitor what content you watch and then use that to terminate or restrict your accounts? Sometimes when PayPal shuts down an account, they don't let you withdraw your money from it. Of these verification measures, an article in the Scientific American says, and this poses obvious opportunities for hacking, theft, and extortion. They interview Professor Olivier Blas, who writes, the worst example would be if you directly collected people's names and the type of website they are trying to access. Then someone could establish a list of who follows certain content, which could be used to target groups such as LGBTQ+ people. That would be terrible. We know that establishing lists is a very bad idea. When he talks about the dangers of the various methods of verification, he talks about how facial recognition would require storing biometric data. That article links to a different one by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which warns, if a website misuses or mishandles the data, the visitor might never find out, and if they do, they might lack an adequate enforcement mechanism. For example, one recent age verification law requires a user to prove damages resulting from the unlawful retention of data in order to hold the website accountable in court. A difficult bar to reach. So this recent span of laws restricting access are likely to result in a massive breach in user privacy. So either that's going to happen or there's going to be a mass exodus from people accessing NSFW in this country. If your goal isn't to protect children, but rather to ban the erotic from existing and enforce your prudish religious control over the populace, this is a good way to do it without running into the pesky issue of outright banning content and running face first into the pesky First Amendment. In the first case, you're probably a hyper-capitalist hoping for porn sites to go the way of Facebook and other social media where the real money is made through selling consumer data. However, it's not the only example of a law that's supposedly meant to protect the vulnerable, actually working out to mostly function as a censorship law banning certain forms of art and expression. Wow, I wonder if that violates the First Amendment. FOSTA is a 2018 law that aims to fight sex trafficking by reducing legal protections for online platforms. The conflation of consensual sex work with sex trafficking, as well as the threat of litigation for websites, has already led to a crackdown, says Megan Farrick-Manish for The Verge. We have our next attempt at protection. This time we're supposedly protecting the victims of sex trafficking, a legitimate issue that plagues the countries aflat the world. Just like the last one, it was tackling a legitimate issue, children accessing content they're not old enough for, but not solving that issue. So we've got our first obvious question, as it's been a few years since FOSTA-SESTA passed. Did it work? As an article from The Nation says, 5 years later, reports from legal scholars, researchers, and the Government Accountability Office conclude that the law has been counterproductive at best and deadly at worst. By most accounts, online sex trafficking remains rampant. To date, article written in October 2023, there has been just one criminal conviction under the law. So it doesn't work. Oopsies. But what has it done? As that same article says, to avoid serious criminal and civil liabilities, many websites and apps now over-regulate all erotic content, much of which is unrelated to sex work. Sarah Rahman argues in Book Riot that self-published erotica has faced increased censorship because of FOSTA. Despite erotica having quite literally nothing to do with trafficking, if you're given an excuse to start banning stuff, why not take it? Or if you're afraid, go ahead and do stupid things just in case. While talking about Tumblr's ban on content, Jason Kobler and Samantha Cole write about FOSTA's effects. Sites have cracked down on NSFW communities or shut down altogether for fear of repercussions of hosting adult content. When platforms attempt to restrict content out of this kind of fear, especially when they have a large user base, they don't really have many options on how to do that. Human moderation would require a large increase in hiring. Famously, Tumblr is broke. Supposedly they lose like $30 million a year, so what you gonna do? Well, you're gonna attempt to use filters and auto mods. The Electronic Frontier Foundation points out the filtering system ended up accidentally targeting the post of a blogger who posted patent designs. They say, Tumblr employs an automated system incapable of being nuanced, resulting in absurd results. Tumblr says it has to use these tools because it's the only thing that can work on a large scale, but that again misses the point that Tumblr didn't need this policy in the first place. It already had rules against illegal content, deciding to accede to puritanical notions of what is acceptable was not necessary. Mid-2023, FOSTA was clarified and restricted by the DC Circuit Court. David Green opines that it's unfortunate the law wasn't overthrown in its entirety, but the court gave some extreme clarification that was welcome. He writes, "We appreciate that the court significantly limited its previously broad reach." He lays out a series of cases that make it seem like the platforms, such as social media, do not aid and abet when they are generally aware of an overall unlawful enterprise. The intermediary must instead knowingly assist a specific wrongful act, and they have to take some affirmative action with intent of facilitating the commission of a specific offense. Okay, so FOSTA doesn't work. The suggestive verification systems pushed by certain states are ripe for mass abuse and also are very easy to skirt around with a VPN, so theoretically also aren't gonna work. But both have been effective at censoring the internet. Even with the DC Circuit Court case, FOSTA's effects can still be felt. There's that Stafford Beer idea. The purpose of a system is what it does. That means its purpose cannot be what it fails to do. FOSTA fails to prevent sex trafficking. It succeeds in causing censorship. In that case, its purpose is the censorship. With that in mind, where lies the proposed Kids Online Safety Act, championed by politicians on both sides of the aisle? In a letter to the Senate Commerce Committee in July 2023, Tech Freedom argues the impact of KOSA remains unchanged from its original language. Adults' First Amendment rights to access content and speak anonymously will be undermined by a de facto age verification requirement. The company also argues that the duty of care the law would require has already, in previous cases, been ruled unconstitutional for violating the First Amendment. In the time since that letter, the proposed bill has changed its language. Presumably, this time, people actually want to protect kids. They want to be what the system does instead of merely what it purports to do. Except, as the ACLU notes, it continues to push for age verification, which we've already been over. Unfortunately, that just doesn't work, guys. Ultimately, the revised version of KOSA still poses threats to our First Amendment rights. EFF says of the updated bill, this language still means increased liability merely for hosting and distributing otherwise legal content that the government, in this case the FTC, claims is harmful. While the updates claim to have restricted the ability of state attorneys general to go after speech that they simply don't like, the EFF says the state attorney general could simply claim that they are not targeting the LGBTQ content, but rather the fact that their content was made available to minors via notifications, recommendation, or other features of a service, which makes it seem like the purpose is still censorship. But that's unconstitutional, so they've put window dressing on it. It seems to me like they're attempting the abortion clinic restriction strategy here. Your horns are 1 inch too narrow according to this new regulation we passed. So now you either need to completely renovate or shut down. The purpose of something is what it does. COSA promises, once again, to censor the internet and probably not actually protect kids. So then that censorship becomes its purpose, just like the other attempts mentioned in this section that claim to be protecting people, but whose most meaningful contribution to the country is an increase in censorship. The shields that these people claim to throw in front of everyone are just simply made of smoke. 3. Fatal Fantasy. In part 2, I started off by listing various concerns people have with NSFW content before I went into each of them one by one. You, being very, very clever and sticking it out through this whole thing, might have caught on that there's one thing I left out: the effects of fiction. We've lived through years of people wondering about the effects of violent video games and violent movies. When I was growing up, there was a push to get smoking out of movies under the idea that having people smoke on screen would cause kids to get a nicotine addiction in an attempt to look cool or something like that. I don't know, I was never a cool kid, I didn't know what they were doing. Thank You for Smoking is a decently funny film that includes a tobacco lobbyist actually pushing for films to return to making smoking sexy. I just thought that was fun. Everyone and their mother is going to tell you about the effects of propaganda because we all learn about that in school because it is a very serious thing throughout history. Pretty much everyone has had a piece of art affect them in some way emotionally, I'm sure. Most of us have also been presented with a fact in a piece of media and simply trusted that art to be presenting us with the truth. I'm not going to contest the idea that art can affect real life. I'm a strong believer in the power of representation, for instance. Hamilton and Head Over Heels have done wonders for some people, me included. Dr. Christopher J. Ferguson in Psychology Today says claims of violent video games being connected to increases in violent behaviors aren't based in evidence, going so far as to claim typically the opposite is actually true. It seems like there's something to the idea of catharsis that a lot of art has. Perhaps such video games and movies act as a cut, bloodletting aggressive instincts before they can reach the point of actual aggression. Professor Alan McKee of the University of Sydney says, "We know..." I don't have an Australian accent. "We know that people are more sexually adventurous are also more likely to consume pornography. That doesn't mean that consuming pornography makes you more sexually adventurous, but a lot of the research claims that it does." I don't know what that voice was, I'm so sorry. As someone who critiques media, I'm not saying we shouldn't critique it or its effects. You know, Arnita Sarkeesian examining sexism in games is a good thing and a valid topic. Likewise, looking into the sexism in a lot of NSFW work is valid and worthwhile. What do people desire? Why? Is it bad? How do those desires interact with negative things in our cultures and systems? All of those are valid questions with interesting answers that you can come to, and none of them can be satisfactorily answered with, "We need to get rid of NSFW." Speaking of the why of desire, is it always as straightforward as we like to think? ContraPoints. I was introduced to ContraPoints in like late 2020 or early 2021, something like that. I was on a date with a nice hairy artist man and we were back at his place watching videos. He asked about video essayists. At that point in time, the only one I really watched was Jenny Nicholson. He told me I needed to watch the videos of someone called ContraPoints. When I saw the screen grabs and titles, I was a little apprehensive in that I thought it was going to be like a Tumblr-esque moralizing rant. I was very pleasantly surprised instead by the philosophy, politics I mostly agreed with, great production value, and funny jokes, which I'm sorry I don't provide. I've been watching her videos when she uploads them ever since. That led me to Lindsay Ellis, Dan Olson, H-Bomb, Philosophy Tube, Belize Easy, Rachel Oates, Fundy Fridays, etc, etc. The channel is the brainchild of professional catgirl impersonator Natalie Wynn. I've really enjoyed her past few videos a lot. The opening bit of The Hunger really made me feel seen with the whole Catholics telling me my depression would go away if I was a Catholic inside B or pretending to be straight or whatever thing that was going on. At time of writing, her latest video is an insanely long video about Twilight. Go watch it. I know this is also a long video and I'm suggesting you go watch a longer video. I'm very evil, yep, but go watch it. You don't have to watch it, but I think it's an excellent deep dive that looks further into certain topics that I'm not going to get too far into here. She also gives genuine consideration and credence to anti-erotic arguments. While I already had this video as a topic to eventually get around to writing in my Google Drive folder where I keep everything, the Contra video made me want to get to it sooner and go a bit more in depth than I probably would have went originally. I wholeheartedly recommend it, and I am going to be discussing some key points Natalie brings up. She uses the idea of the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer and the cultural reaction to that series as a jumping off point to talk about fiction and desire itself. Of the critiques against Twilight for its danger it supposedly poses, she says, the main line of argument against Twilight is that this type of story normalizes and romanticizes abusive relationship dynamics. It's a monkey see, monkey do theory of media analysis, this moralistic cinema sense thing that everyone is doing now. I see the obsessive moral policing of the romance genre as a continuation of literally centuries of concern that women are reading the wrong kinds of books. But as she reveals, the more she goes into her consideration of desire itself, this isn't even necessarily about women's erotica. There's a lack of consideration for what fantasy itself is, how it does and doesn't intersect with actual want, and how we as a species seem conflicted over sexuality. We're uncomfortable with it. According to Freud, or like my understanding of the Psychology Today article about Freud, the discomfort we have over sexuality, is sometimes urged by an acknowledgement of asocial tendencies that acting on desire might cause, sometimes what you want could hurt someone, can cause us to transform that desire into something else. We sublimate it. The article gives an example of a man who covets his neighbor's wife, and instead of acting on that, he uses that as fuel for exercise, housework, creativity. If we think that productivity is often caused by the sublimation of our desires, if society on some level runs on that sublimation, then that makes sense to push back against expression of those sexual thoughts. You look at Dubcon and get grossed out, maybe. Jenny Nicholson reviewed the book Troll and theorized that maybe if it was popular enough, it could kill the dubious consent romance novel because it's gross. The Dubious Yes. Do you know what the Omegaverse is? Omegaverse is, as Lindsay Ellis puts it, a subgenre of romance. Of course, that means it's also a subgenre of erotica, and a lot of the tropes can appear across literature. If you don't know, in the Omegaverse, people are classified as normally 3 secondary sexes or genders, depending on their wording. You can either be an alpha, a beta, or an omega. Sometimes that means a dom, a normie, or a submissive. Sometimes that means one who impregnates normie, one who is impregnated. No, I don't really know how the straight versions of it go down when there's an omega male. I don't read straight stuff. Recommend some down below. I'm kidding, I'm not gonna read it. An extremely common trope in the Omegaverse is the presence of pheromones that almost exist as magic. I've read manga where alphas almost battle by releasing their pheromones and try to overpower each other. It's delightfully silly. Sometimes spooky. Alpha pheromones are often dominating. They're like the soul pressures in Bleach. Christian Grey is Byakuya. Don't sign the contract, Captain Hitsugaya. Omegas often give off sweet pheromones that can be hard to control and might bring alphas and betas in to take care of them. In a lot of Omegaverse stories, heats are important plot devices. Someone enters a period of time where they can't control their pheromones and often need to spend some time taking care of themselves physiologically or being taken care of by someone else. The presence of pheromones and heat cycles make Omegaverse as a genre largely, at best, dubious consent. Dubcon. Therefore, the genre is banned on Amazon as erotica, and it's banned in most places as a genre for film and art. When someone fantasizes about Omegaverse, are they saying they believe in or want to live in a world where the facts of biology make assault a necessity? As someone who has enjoyed plenty of Omegaverse BL manga, no. I've mentioned this briefly before, but I've been on the receiving end of that sort of violence, and it messes with you when I least expect it sometimes still. I don't want to experience that again, and I definitely don't want anyone else to experience that. But I still enjoy those BL stories. So what is the fantasy there? In her Twilight video, ContraPoints talks about non-con and dub-con fantasies. After discussing the popularity throughout history of ravishment fantasies, she says, the non-consent fantasy is a device that absolves the woman from blame. If she's being forced, then it's not her fault. It allows us to distance ourselves from our sexuality. Alternatively, in the case of Omegaverse, it allows us to imagine purely surrendering ourselves to them. What would it be like for the world to be built around giving into sexual desire? What if we were animalistic in some way? Alternatively, again, fantasies such as this let us engage in narcissistic desire without having to confront that. We want to be loved. We want others to love, and we want them to love us. We want to be desirable. In Omegaverse and other dubcon and non-con fantasies, we become so desirable that even the handsome man who has it all has to have us, or else his life is incomplete and worthless. Now, we can recognize those sorts of dynamics as abuse in the real world while separating out the fantasy of it. A lot of people find those types of scenes in media hard to handle. There's plenty of critique for Game of Thrones for using assault as such a constant plot and character device, to the point where plenty of people thought it was fueled primarily by a level of sexism. Yes, ending that possibility, I also want to talk about the healing potential of that kind of fantasy. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this on the channel before as well, but the first film I saw with that sort of scene after my own unfortunate history was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the movie that has the best opening credit sequence ever put to film. Oh my god. It was very hard to watch that when that scene came on. I was death gripping the hand of my then boyfriend. He warned me before the scene happened. He told me that we could skip it. He was very sweet about the whole thing. I watched it. Though it was hard to watch, it helped. Sometimes the fantasy of questionable consent is the fantasy of surviving it, of being able to disengage whenever you feel like it, to be able to put it away. You can put it in that old sock drawer, but you don't have to take my word for it. When these sorts of moments happen in romance, they tend to get classified as dark romance. In exploring that subgenre for Paste magazine, Kayleigh Donaldson says, these stories talk of love not only as the most important thing in the world, but as something worth destroying the planet for. Life doesn't always have a happy ending, so finding passion in the hopeless is an enthralling alternative. After reading a dark romance, you get to turn on the light. There is control in reading disturbing things. Horror movies function much the same way. You get to explore your fears without any of the mortal peril. That's what makes them fun. Horror works because you can walk away from it. Consent fantasies are the same. Kate Lister says, the first thing that needs to be established is these are not fantasies about rape. They are about submission and domination. She cuts straight through the theater and outward expression of the desire and goes to the core of it, at least as she sees it. Oftentimes, it's about playing with submission or, on the other end, domination, of being able to give and take what you want. One person that she interviews says, I think it's more about being desirable. I know that sounds daft, but in my fantasy, the man is so overcome with lust for me that he just has to have me. Based on the ads I've seen on certain websites for studio films, this sort of fantasy continues to move credits, or I guess Bitcoin, or whatever Dogecoin scam people are using to cash their spank bank checks on these days. The Lonely Island song is a popular category of adult video. Domination videos, invaders, do me a favor, you have to pay rent. This pizza ain't free. And they've been there from the start. Greek myth is filled with non-con. Zeus does all sorts of depraved things that we would frown upon in real life. And these scenes get spattered on urns, and the Athenians would grab their olives and gather round. But despite the popularity, most people don't walk around looking to assault anyone. It's almost as if fantasy is separate from intention and asocial tendencies, and those are also separate from action. Tentacles. Is there any more asocial tendency than being the devastating and unknowable fear that is Cthulhu, Overlord of the Seas' final evolution of Pokemon Squidward? If there is, it's probably liking anime. As an anime enjoyer myself, I've seen some of the worst art ever created, and yes, I've loved every single second of it. At the mall near the town I grew up in, there was an FYE store that had an entire aisle of anime DVDs. I would browse through it every time that I went there. If you've not been to a video store with anime, then okay, imagine 2/3 of the shelves have like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, Fairy Tail, all the covers of all the anime everyone watches. Then there's the end of the aisle where all the covers are hidden by decency panels. Behind them is, you guessed it, Pokemon. No, it's hentai. And of course, when you think anime weirdo and NSFW, you have to think of Tentacles. Katie Drell over at Glamour points out in a funny article that the idea predates anime by a few centuries, but its popularity today isn't merely a continuation, it's innovation. According to Toshio Mesa, the appendages were used as a way to flout Japan's stringent obscenity laws. Japan does not like anatomy. They like lightsabers. What is the medium ground between human anatomy and lightsabers? Tentacles? The article goes on to claim it's basically a version of bondage fantasy, a submission fantasy, often a non-con fantasy. But what if it's also something entirely different? I watched a film on Hulu called Tentacles because it promised to be a weird psychosexual horror film, and I love those. It's part of a series called Into the Dark, I think. That's what the interweb said. I haven't seen any of the rest of those films. I don't believe in good or bad art. I don't think those are things. But for me, this was the case of a film being too restrained and afraid of its premise. Ascetic. There are tentacle creatures that seduce humans and slowly morph into them in the film, eventually killing them. What happens when someone unknowingly falls in love with one of those creatures? That sounds like such an amazing premise. I ended up disappointing myself by expecting an altogether different film, and that's not good criticism. Brian Tallarica really gets to what I was thinking in his review of the film for Roger Ebert. I wish there was some way to show you other than sex or talking, some way to touch brain. In most episodes of Into the Dark, there's a turning point, a moment in the film where it could really take off and become its best self. Here, Tentacles threatens to become true Cronenberg-esque psychosexual body horror, to truly get into how passion can physically change us. A journey of two people who become so obsessed with one another they ignore warning signs and spiral into a Lovecraftian nightmare. Sign me up, please. To put it another way, what if Junji Ito's Uzumaki was an erotic horror? What if the balls of spiraling flesh were the results of love, creatures of true ascendance and connection? Did I do it? Did I trick you into thinking this is going to be about anime? No, baby, we are talking body horror and monsters. Why do we eroticize the horrifying? I'm not asking about fear sublimation. Sublimation is the next section. Don't get ahead of me. But for now, I'm not as curious as to why we tackle fear with desire, but why we desire things that are inhuman. Take tentacles and slime. Generally, these are magical creatures, some horrors, either monstrous or alien in some way. Sometimes the erotic is how we explore religion. This isn't merely submission to another human, it's to something above humanity, a creature at whose mercy all of us are, and instead of destroying you, it makes love to you. Angels are a really popular creature in romance books, especially for urban fantasy romances nowadays. Alpha males with wings, with magic. But the popularity isn't just because flying is cool, right? I mean, it is, but still. The word angel is specifically used. What is the fantasy of being taken by an angel? Well, it could be a want to cross the taboo. The fleshes that shouldn't mix in the Bible are angelic and human, after all. But I think it also stems from a general desire for love. In this case, divine love. To be the mate of an angel is to be a chosen one. It's to be told that the tribulations may be harsh, but the promised Eden has a space for you, and it will be a pleasurable space. People who fantasize about getting abducted by aliens are fantasizing about being desirable and being chosen by a higher plane of being. They're not literally wanting to be kidnapped and treated like a zoo animal. Vampires work under a similar sort of fantasy half the time. You don't want to die, you want to be chosen. Back to Tentacles. What if you don't fantasize about getting caught, but doing the netting? What if you want to be the slime creature that takes the human form? There's still a fantasy of domination there, sure, yeah, that's a common thing, it's a trend. There's a fantasy of magic, which is a power fantasy, a control fantasy, a desire to be special. What does being the tentacle get you, though? It gets you the ability to hold on to your loved ones forever. You get to transcend the bounds of what it means to be human. And if you transcend those bounds, maybe you don't have to die. And if you don't have to die, and you're a tentacle monster who can hold on to your loved ones as long as you want, maybe they don't have to die either. It can easily become fantasy of heaven, taken to the erotic. Think about zombies. There's that movie based on a book, Warm Bodies. On one hand, it's a metaphor for being deserving of love no matter what your circumstances. Oh my god, it's Romeo and Juliet. But what does it mean to imagine yourself as the zombie? Are you wanting to partake in a rampant consumption, consumerism without guilt? Are you a Vore kind of dude? Or is it a fantasy about transcending death and being able to choose who you want to take with you? Monsters often have a way of revealing what we want in utopia. The undead are often an expression of the desire to cheat death, the desire for heaven on earth. The alien are an expression of a desire for desirability, to be chosen by the highest powers that there might ever be. Erotic horror is often an enemy of self-publishing platforms. They just despise the stuff. They don't want violence caught up in their desire. But isn't desire often violence? Not in an asocial way, but it is a wound on the ego. The ego bruises even when the flesh does not. The physical acts mimic violent acts. OnlyFans and JustForFans want nothing to do with horror. Smashwords and Amazon think erotica cannot have action or fear. In doing so, they completely misunderstand erotic horror, and they also misunderstand the nature of the erotic in the first place. Or alternatively, they do understand, and they just don't care. They ignore the realities of fantasy to embrace conservative, willful ignorance, to embrace censorship. I know which of those I think is worse. Family. Speaking of worse, I'd say if you asked someone the absolute worst fantasies someone could have, they would tell you non-con, which we've already talked about, kids, which we are not going to talk about, death, which we're gonna get to later, and family, which is right now. Horror stories about family relations are well laid throughout human history. Carve-outs for abortion are often laid out as exemptions for rape, incest, and health of the mother. For that second one, it almost seems a little redundant. You know, most acts of that kind are the non-con variety. There's an inherent power imbalance to most family relations that removes an aspect of consent, especially when they cross age boundaries. Now, sometimes this exemption is for the health of the child. Genes crossing like that can lead to birth defects that can make life inviable except for a few torturous hours. Obviously, that's not always the case, but at this point in time, we recognize it as a taboo that should not be crossed. At the same time, we seem to have a cultural fascination with it. Maybe that's not a contradiction. The placement of taboo goes a long way to explaining a lot of fantasies on its own. To cross the boundaries of human society, to be free in a way no one is allowed to destroy society, etc., etc. People find it exciting, the idea of crossing taboo. Not even necessarily about the specific taboo. As I mentioned in part 1, this type of erotica is banned on Amazon, Patreon, and OnlyFans. It's frowned on at Smashwords, and who knows what's going on with JustForFans? Now, of course, with erotica, it's confusing, as erotica involves no actual people in any way at any actual point in time, no matter what the subject matter. Is there a legal reason to ban it? No. Is it because of credit card companies and people being insane? Well, put a pin in that. How about on film sites with actual people? They require consent documents from the performers. On OnlyFans, for instance, they either have to have an account, or you have to have written consent and ID ready to send the website's way. So besides actual family being illegal, they could theoretically run a background check or do a few Googles and see if you're related. So they know that these videos are just pretend, because erotic film is just film, actors playing characters. In that case, why is it banned? Cassandra Clare's Mortal Instruments series is often derided by moralizing types who think it's a sin on Clare's part to have included a plotline that teased a family relationship between siblings. They weren't raised together or anything like that. The main pair. It explores what it's like to have forbidden desires and the conflict that causes you. It's almost like the people playing moral cinema sins let their gut reactions remove their ability to actually engage with media, almost like it's a bad tendency. The Mortal Instruments is all about the forbidden, the profane, the sacred, and its defilement. As ContraPoints might say, the romantic plotline of the Mortal Instruments turns out to be disavowal. The bad boy is bad, so the good girl gets to stay good. We can call this disavowal, the process of constructing fantasy situations where your desires are gratified without having to assert or ever having to acknowledge the desire. Clary, the lead in the book, I know, such a subtle name. I wonder where Cassandra Clare got the name Clary. She's in love with someone who's revealed to be her brother. Then it turns out he isn't actually her brother. In the book where that's revealed, City of Glass, she gets a new love interest who kisses her, and she doesn't like that kiss. Kind of grosses her out. It turns out that Jace, the brother, is not actually her brother, but the weird kissy evil assassin boy is. That's the final form of the disavowal. See, when it's her actual brother, her soul knows to be grossed out because it's icky. Haha, that wasn't an integral part of the fantasy at all. Just as with non-con, there's one series that comes to mind for a lot of people when they think of family in NSFW context, and that would be Game of Thrones. It's an aspect of the series that fascinates people. You know, that trend continues still with the other series set in the same world, House of the Dragon. Julia Naftulin went digging into why that is in an article for Business Insider. She comes to the conclusion that it's because of the taboo nature. Taboo makes us curious. We peek through our fingers as someone crosses the boundaries. We want to see the wages of sin. She links to a Male magazine article that says family is everywhere. As one actor puts it, everything you see now is mom's got this, mom's got that. Hey, yay, yay, mum. MILF has been popular as a general term the entire time I've been an adult. Think about gay slang too. People are always mothering. Someone will turn up in a sickening sexy outfit and someone will go, she's so mother for that, yes. Part of the explanation for that might be the numbers of people who actually enjoy or have on some level family fantasy. The Male magazine article asserts that it's about 1/5 of the population, and it's been a fascination for a long time, they point out, including the obvious Oedipus. ContraPoints posits that the Oedipus complex isn't necessarily real in a literal way, but in a metaphorical version. In her video Envy, she says, it's not that you literally desire a mother, right? That would be weird. It's more that you desire the archetype, mother. What is the mother archetype? And Twilight Natalie says, why is the ocean inherently erotic? Well, because of the rhythmic expansion-contraction cycles of her wave motion. Yes, of course, but also because she's mother, because she's life, she's birth, she's death, she's the primal horror of horrors and the sweet womb of Mother Night. Family fantasy then and can sometimes be said to be a desire for peace, a connection to creation. The gods make more gods at the family reunion on Mount Olympus. The womb is birth. Aimed at mother, it's going for the peace, returning to a state of protection kind of angle. Aimed at offspring, it can be an embrace of the act of creation, to be a god. It can partially be fueled by nostalgia. If you view your days living with your family as the good old days, something you can never get back but will always miss, this sort of fantasy can simply be indulging in nostalgia in a way, even if you'd be grossed out thinking about your actual family that way. Or it could be the opposite. Say you did not have a great relationship or you didn't know your family. This sort of fantasy can be a way of indulging in that trauma. Most people interested in it don't want anything to do with anyone actually related to them, but it symbolizes a time when life was less stressful, less burdensome, more connected, more loved, even if that isn't the actual case. Even if you're romanticizing the memories like we often do, that aspect is there. For some people, not all. Think about shipping as well. In the supernatural fandom, there were really two popular ships. Destiel, Dean and Cass, that ended with gay superhelp, and Wincest, a relationship between Sam and Dean, the two main leads, who are brothers. Why was that so popular? Well, the two have chemistry. They fight to the death for each other. They fight each other, but it's their familiar love that drives the show forward. They know deep, deep facts about each other. They're always there despite the bickering, and most other characters on the show aren't around long or often if they are around for a while. People long for romance. They took a deep bond that was available. It was available. It provided comfort for the characters in their mind. This Refinery 29 article suggests that the popularity in visual mediums might be because of the implied narrative, especially as NSFW is increasingly found on places like OnlyFans, where the action, I assume, rarely has the context of the story, perhaps because of the assumption that it's documentary rather than film. So perhaps the implied story of having pre-existing relationships provides more meaning and depth, which makes it easier for some people to watch. You can imagine these people know and love each other already. They've had conflict and binding moments that have led them to this moment of passion. That story fills a space many find lacking in the content they otherwise absorb. Contrary to claims of taboo and depravity, the Refinery 29 article even suggests for some people it provides a sense of safety in a world of NSFW art that's filled with violence. As one person they quote says, "Family always feels safe." And safety can be really important in erotic fantasy for some people. But I think the ultimate reason for this fantasy in art is seen in Cassandra Clare's novels. It represents a taboo, and that taboo lets you explore what it means to love, what it means to be denied love. What is desire? When is it good? When is it not? How do we handle being given everything we've ever wanted, having it yanked away, and then having it dangled in front of our faces? I think that's a really interesting set of concepts to explore. Blanket banning the topic, as many self-publishing spaces do, seems like a shame. And when people push for the same censorship, even when they don't have the power to enact it, that also seems like a shame. You can just not engage with art, guys. You don't have to get rid of it. Like, maybe chill out and have a less self-important way of looking at the world. Saltburn. So it seems like a lot of these things people are concerned about, the suggestion we're being corrupted by their existence in media, that they might lead to dangerous actions in the real world, are removed from what desire actually is in the vast majority of cases with regards to these fantasies. So the intent to censor has to either be based in that misunderstanding or in spite of actually understanding, in which case it is a lie meant to restrict the expression of others for the purpose of crafting a restrictive, puritanical, conservative world where repression and asceticism are prime. Let's relatively quickly go over some other fantasies and what their hidden desires might actually be. Bathroom stuff. There's degradation and the taboo, sure, but it also is the ultimate act of submission and of domination. It takes supreme trust. It can be an eroticization of the concept of recycling and rebirth, a form of nurturing forcing. Blood. Remember that scene in Saltburn? She tries to warn him off, almost like she thinks she's unclean. Much like with the one before this, that makes it an acceptance of someone in their filth. A statement that you are so desirable that nothing can turn someone away. You have worth. In the film, the character has incredibly low self-esteem. Barry's character does this because he knows it plays into her ultimate desire, to be shown that she is worthy of love even if she is the horrid creature that she thinks she is, or that she fears she might be. The vampire will still take her blood. Blood also represents life itself, birth, continuation. Its place in fantasy can be an embrace of life, a viewing of intimacy as the place where safety and love is found at the end of danger, or in spite of danger, a symbol of safety, fantasizing that there can still come pleasure and joy when you are hurt. Aquaria and Eureka. Drag queens dressed up as beefing babies on a fake talk show. You know, the most RuPaul thing to ever exist. So, the fantasy connected to that. What's that about? Caretaking. That's what it is. It isn't like people will claim a desire for young. It can be a desire for innocence and its corruption. Sure, people love that, but really, isn't it a want to take care of someone and a want to be taken care of? It's dom sub, but with stereotypically aftercare acts being almost the whole of the event. It's a desire to be needed and a desire to be loved at your weakest. I suppose, though, it could be a way for an inclined individual to slightly sublimate their desire into a non-dangerous form. Well, hey, there's that word sublimate again. 4. Sub-Sub-Sublimation. After all of that, I do have another question for you. I know I keep asking you these. Are fantasies of NSFW about the fantasy? And I don't mean that on a what if non-con fantasies are about the concept of safely exploring consent or allowing yourself to have desire. I mean, what if fantasies are sometimes about tangential subject matter that may seem wholly unrelated? When I was writing my poetry collection, Butterfly Snuff, out now on Amazon, I wrote a whole lot about my relationship with intimacy as a concept. One poem in the collection is called Snuff Sublimate. In it, I talk about mental health and how that interacts with the erotic, specifically Vore. Vorophilia is a fetish similar to cannibalism. In an NSFW context, it's the sexualization of consumption. But it doesn't have to be NSFW, much like a lot of subject matter we consider erotic. For instance, my introduction to the concept was through Dragon Ball Z. One of the big bags is this bug-looking dude called Cell. Cell has a stinger-like tail, stabs people and sucks the nutrients out. Think of it similar to the energy draining in the new manga and Coco Delta, but where the drained vanish. For particularly powerful beings, he doesn't drain them. Instead, his tail opens up and swallows them whole like a python. Dragon Ball Z has a particular fascination with Vore. The next major enemy is Boo, the bubblegum beast, and his main thing too is eating people, though he likes to turn them into cookies and then nom on them. The majority of Vore content is not really related to the pop cultural ideas of cannibalism. Cooking, chopping, gore, those are part of their own subgenre called hard Vore, and from what I can tell, the majority of people into Vore in general aren't necessarily into that aspect, and they certainly aren't into the idea of actual instances of violence and desecration. Now, we can go over this like we did other fantasies in the previous section. There's metaphorical connection to returning to the womb. You see a lot of fetal positions in film and art to signify a desire for safety or a signal of innocence. So, you know, when you're eating, you go into that. It can also be seen as a desire for surrender, for trust, for safety. A want to consume someone else can be a desire to be loved deeply, to possess someone in the safety that they will never leave you. On the other hand, it can be a way to process the idea that love and relationships will end. Consumption makes leaving into a metaphor for growth. Those you come across will make your life better, even if they go away. You gain something. The opposite goes for those who fantasize about being the food, let's say. That your presence in someone's life is nourishing, even if it's only temporary. It can be a desire to give care. Often it's an expression of dom-sub relationships, as a lot of these are. Longing for power and control, and for submission and surrender. There's a deep intimacy in the act. A person on the prey end of things might view predation as someone needing them so wholeheartedly they have no option except to consume them. A pred might view it as being able to give into their desires, to carry life in their stomach, and to have choice over whether to birth it or regain it or get rid of it. You can go even deeper into the metaphor of it. I mentioned the biblical idea of sexuality being expression of power and place in the food chain, designating human and non-human through various acts. Vore is a sort of literalization of that idea in some cases. But that's not when it ends. If you're subjected to your place on the food chain, does willingly placing yourself in a lower tier equate to complete surrender, or is it elevation to the divine? Cannibalism is of course frowned upon in the Bible, if for no other reason than the whole you shall not kill thing. To consume another person is to turn them into the animal, similar to the powers of sexual dynamics. Only one person is allowed to lower themselves on the food chain. And who is that? Jesus Christ, of course. Transubstantiation equaling cannibalism is like a stupid gotcha people attempt to pull on Catholics or others who partake in the Eucharist, but let this be his flesh and this be his blood. To consume it provides holiness. To offer it is to be the ultimate in the divine. To lower oneself on the food chain is a privilege only God is allowed to possess. In that way, Vore can be a chasing of the divine. It can be the existential search for meaning. Did you just roll your eyes? I mean, you probably should have. It's an easy fetish to be grossed out by, to judge, to be cruel to the people who fantasize about it. But then again, people do that with pretty much every desire. The gut instinct, pun very much intended, is to denigrate any sexual drive that we ourselves do not share. Is that juvenile? For the most part, yeah. But I want to use this as a jumping off point to ask if desire is not sometimes sublimation of other emotions. In a Vice article by Richard Greenhill, one of the interviewed Vorophiles talks about how Little Red Riding Hood was the first time they were introduced to the broad concept of Vore, and the story terrified them. Conception is a chief focal point of horror. You have Jaws, teeth, zombie films, vampire media. We fear the ocean partially because we fear the giants of the depths who might pop out and get us. Black holes carry fascination because they hunger and cannot be resisted nor sated. For this person, that existential fear eventually crossed over into desire. But did it? What if it didn't get replaced by desire? What if fear was sublimated into desire? That kind of goes directly against the Freudian version of sublimation, that it's the transformation of sexuality into acceptable actions or desires, but it's not an exact opposite. It plays into the same idea. In our society, we make fun of people for being scared. We have our stiff upper lips. We call each other sissies and pussies for not being brave enough. Scaredy cat is one of the first insults you learn as a child. To be scared is supposedly a bad thing. So in the case of this respondent, he took a socially unacceptable emotion and turned it into sexual expression. Later on in the article, he talks about how he likes to imagine himself as a prey, but in interactions with others, he's more comfortable presenting as the predator. If this is a fear sublimation, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? The fear of the big bad wolf is not being the wolf most of the time, it's being Little Red. So on his own, he can safely fantasize about being in her position, but in interacting with someone else, he connects deeper with the predator. He says those characters are always more fleshed out than his prey ones. Theoretically, if being on the prey side of things while playing with someone else would put him in a closer position to the fear he originally started with, that would make sense why he would avoid it. So after fear gets turned into desire, that's when we get the second sublimation, the Freudian one. These people aren't actually going out eating each other, they're making art and erotica, and they're doing role-playing on Discord or something. That's taking a sexual drive and sublimating it into art in a way. But fear isn't the only thing that can be turned into desire. The title of my poetry collection, Butterfly Snuff, comes from the titles of two poems, The Midnight Butterfly and Snuff Sublimate. I'm not going to read out the whole thing here, but the premise is a person getting eaten by a giant. The line that connects this tangent to it is, I have Kafka'd suicide into snuff sublimate. I posit a theory about my personal relationship to poor mental health, suggesting that I have taken certain impulses and transformed them to the realm of fantasy desire. By doing that, there's an outlet to express and explore those feelings whilst firmly shutting them out of reality. There probably isn't going to be a giant from Attack on Titan or something to swallow me whole. It's a defense against acting on the worst impulses of my brain. I no longer have any thought that I might actually do these things. They're just fantasy. Combined together with the interview where fear morphs into desire, I wonder if Freud's concept of sublimation is generally only the second half of a process. What if there are a lot of feelings and desires that are unacceptable in one way or another that then get transformed into erotic desire, which is easier to express and deal with half the time. And then that repressed desire, by its nature and our compulsion towards social compassion, sublimates into art and productivity, like Freud says. If that idea holds any weight, then what happens when we remove art? Can we add a third layer of sublimation, or does it then start to loop back? Does desire become compulsion, or does it continue even further? If you sublimate fear into desire into art, if art no longer becomes an option, do you start to desire fear and danger, or do you crash into overwhelming anxiety and paranoia? Admittedly, this is an odd desire to think about, so let's explore some other, maybe less savory subjects. Human pets. Woof. I've had that thing for over a year, never really used it, and no matter what I do to it, if I bathe it in vinegar, if I have it bathe in sunlight, it still smells like chemicals, which I guess is rubber glue. That's what the internet seems to think. 0 out of 10 don't recommend if you don't want to mess up your throat. If you're attuned to gay spaces, you may have noticed in recent years the proliferation of pup boys. It's a subculture of BDSM. In a way, you could think of it as an equivalent to cat girls, though cat boys are also a thing, and I love them. I talked about the phenomenon of nekomimi when I explored how the popular role-playing adventure game Genshin Impact handles gender and sexuality. In it, I suggest that animalification can serve as an exploration of gender and a signifier of queerness. Cat boys in anime find their origin in BL, supposedly. The Catboy manga is, of course, Loveless by Yun Koga. I haven't read it since I was a child, and I don't remember much of it, to be honest, and I don't really plan on reading it again. As far as I know, it's not finished yet. But for the Genshin video, I read a paper by T.A. Noonan that does a deep dive into how the nekomimi of it all is comparable to Western concept of the Playboy bunny. You take a symbol of innocence and you corrupt it. That plays into the desire for the taboo. Plenty of people are attracted to the idea of defilement, perhaps as a subconscious rebellion against religion or society or something along those lines. I have a somewhat young look to me sometimes for my age, so I've been subject to some incredibly creepy messages on Grindr. When I was in my early 20s, sometimes people would accuse me of being a kid and then be like, but do you still want to meet up? That was upsetting. But it can often be similar to the caretaking desire we discussed with the regression roleplay in the fantasy section. Perhaps it's a nostalgia for innocence, an attempt to reclaim lost innocence. That's not necessarily the sort of sublimation we're talking about in this section. Another booktube creator I occasionally watch is Crow Caller, aka the author A.M. Bloschild. One of the first videos of Crow's I saw is that one YA dystopia about human pets. It's a review of the YA series Perfected by Kate Jarvik Birch. And yes, it is about human pets. There's not a maximum ride gene splicing with animals thing going on here either. These pets are pure humans. I haven't read the book, so I'm not really going to make any commentary on them, but based on Crow's video and the Goodreads reviews that I looked at, that premise seems to really get to people. There's a lot of talk about how it isn't realistic, about how there should be some animalification, but I think here that would ruin the fantasy injected into it, wouldn't it? Kind of like how we talked about with Cassandra Clare's books. And just a side note, I'm not commenting on the ethical nature of what goes on in those books. I don't know the plot. I'm just commenting on the vague idea. This is not a furry book. This is a pet play book. And pet play can often be an offshoot, albeit less instinctively horrifying, of erotic slavery. That's a somewhat popular fantasy that exists out there. If you go searching for free NSFW games to play, there are a lot of options with that as a central plot point or fact of the world building. No, I'm not going to name any of them because most of the names would get me banned. On the most basic level, it's a non-consent fantasy taken to the extreme. Hypnosis, substance use, violence, bondage, possession, mind control. To some degree, those fantasies all revolve around disavowal. It's a way of engaging in desire without any of the blame and shame that often, unfortunately, comes with desire. But that's also maybe too simple. We can't throw that blanket on everyone who has those fantasies. Some people are curious about what it would be like to be a sex worker, for instance, and this fantasy allows them to explore that desire without, again, shame. Much with non-con fantasies sometimes being a way to safely explore past trauma, I do bet that there are a handful of people out there who engage in this fantasy, consciously or not, as a way to explore ancestral inherited trauma. That is a very sensitive subject to explore and not one that I'm going to touch really, but it's one you can feel free to look into. What if it also exists as sublimation though? I want to suggest that human pets and similar phenomenon can be born from anxiety. Now, if you're familiar with pup play, that's not going to come as a surprise to you. If you're not familiar, this might help. Matt Baum writes in The Stranger, "If you're having trouble understanding the appeal of puppy play, just imagine how amazing it would be if there were a form of group relaxation where you could empty your mind of all your cares, forget all your responsibilities, lower all of your defenses, and bypass small talk forever. Now imagine that vigorous cuddling and praise are key components of this relaxation technique. And did I mention snacks? You get snacks. Awesome. Why aren't we pupping right now?" The article tells the story of a trans man who was racked by anxiety but would go on to be a confident performer that could play with femininity and still be embraced and celebrated as a man in queer spaces. That's not nothing. Tucker discovered that his unease melted away when he was a poodle. Think about the stereotype of a golden retriever boyfriend. Sweet, loving himbos who might be a bit unaware of their size, however you want to take that. They love freely and openly. They have a lot of affection. They feel safe. It doesn't always seem like they've got a lot going on. Importantly, they don't seem consumed by the demons. That's the appeal of submission for a lot of submissives. You can order 1,000,000 of me at Subway and then I'm an Italian herbs and cheese sub. I was talking about this with a fellow Italian sandwich, and we arrived at a similar idea. Anxiety and stress push him and his ambition in his day-to-day life. When in the hands of a more dominant man, he doesn't have to think about any of that. He doesn't have to be stressed. You don't have to make choices. You don't have to worry. You don't have to think. Just listen to my voice and do as I say. Good boy. Good boy. Now, is that sublimation? In a way, I'd say. At its core, what is anxiety? It's fear. Fear of what? Pain, loss? If you zoom out far enough, doesn't every fear kind of come down to death? Not even death, to the whole. Deep inside of you. Primordial chaos. From nothing we were to nothing we shall become. The big crunch. Bounce. Bounce. Bop. Woof. Goodness. If we fear the nothingness, what happens when we eroticize its embrace? To not have to think or make decisions is to be dead in a way, but while still living. Rather than dealing with anxiety, pup play is a form of rejection. Rejecting anxiety can sometimes lead to healing, but it isn't necessarily in and of itself going to do that. I need a break. I need to stop. I need to cease. Can someone please slip me into a coma? So as someone who has dealt with mental illness for many years, I still have shame when those thoughts and drives come to me. Submission is a way of avoiding the shame by instead turning those thoughts into a more acceptable form, a desire for submission. Even if, yes, a lot of people find that weird. Weird is different from shameful, you know, and the further you go in that, and the further you can go in some of your own demons, sometimes the more extreme your submissive desires are. Think for a moment about degradation. These are the exact mean things I want you to say to me. Well, what if those mean things are also an expression of what you feel yourself about who you are? Well, saying those things is frowned upon. You're not supposed to be self-deprecating. You're not supposed to hate yourself. That is shameful. We have attached such negative stigma to those sorts of thoughts, and they are dangerous. They're not good to have. But if you do have them, how do you deal with that? Well, for some people, you sublimate that by not acknowledging it in your day-to-day life, but instead eroticizing it. And that's what I'm getting at here. Call me mean names, degrade me, make me do things, bully me, please, senpai. These are all ways of interacting with that and turning it from shame to weird desire. Again, weird is different from shameful. And when you're losing a battle to your own brain, that distinction can be very important. I mean, not to be dramatic over kink and desire, but it can be life and death. MPreg. Okay, maybe that was to be dramatic in a way to set up this next section because I thought that was a somewhat funny segue. Alex Garland's Civil War has been all over Twitter recently, and by recently I mean when I first started writing this, which was a while ago. People have been making fun of the map in it since the first teasers came out. There are anti-voting leftists who tried dunking on Garland for making a film about Civil War and then talking about the importance of voting because in their mind the revolution is coming and it will be a good thing, and it's not coming, and it's not going to be a good thing if it did. Guys, I'm so serious, please get over that. Before Civil War the movie, though, there was men. Doesn't that sound like the plot of an accidentally problematic feminist book? Before the Civil War, there was men. Now, there were only women. Honestly, it's kind of like an intriguing enough premise that I would watch it. I watched Men with a lot of high expectations because I adored Annihilation and I really enjoyed Ex Machina. I also really like Jessie Buckley as an actress. I'm Thinking of Ending Things is my favorite film of all time, and she turns out a stunning performance in it. So I had high expectations. Did I like Men? I mean, I love Men, but I mean the movie. The movie was but you can trust Garland to always serve you at least something great, and Unhinged, which honestly are kind of the same thing. Spoiler alert, but towards the end of the movie, the antagonist starts like a series of MPreg birth scenes. The actor just keeps giving birth to himself in all of these grotesque and absolutely wonderful ways, and it's the most insane thing that I've seen in a movie, and that is a compliment because by God, I loved it. Please inject that shit straight into my veins. Please make more movies with weird stuff like that. MPreg stands for male pregnancy. Is MPreg real? I mean, for some trans guys, yeah, power to them. Most often you see it in texts concerning cis guys though. Castiel MPreg, Sasunaru, Aether and his harem. It's also a staple of Omegaverse works. Omega males can get pregnant. Sometimes that's only by alphas and sometimes that's by any guy who can do the depositing. To answer why people are into MPreg, don't we have to ask about why people fantasize about pregnancy in the first place? There are a lot of people into the risk aspect of pregnancy. Gay TikTok is filled with the joke of, we keep trying to have a baby. A guy saying, I'm going to get you pregnant can be quite nice. Business Insider says that sort of desire is likely rooted in general transformations of fear and danger into the erotic. The risk of pregnancy, even if it isn't possible, carries a sort of danger, a risk of a sort of death. Birth is death. That can be thrilling in a sort of fear sublimation way. I don't want children. I don't want to be a parent. Getting pregnant or getting someone pregnant would ruin my life. People don't like it when you talk like that. Transforming that into a desire allows you to explore that space in a safe-ish sort of way. But what about pregnancy itself? And Carrie Reisman explores why some men like pregnant women in that way in an article for Fatherly. It seems like some of it is sexism, a sort of, she's doing what women are made for and she's fertile. There's a physical aspect for how pregnancy can affect someone's appearance in positive ways. There can also be a sort of anti-impregnation thing. There's no risk with someone who's already pregnant. She's got a baby. The risk is gone. It could be about creation itself. This is an act of the divine. If it's your child, there can be an ego ownership thing, you know, pride, continuation of your line, and in a way, a metaphorical extension into your own immortality, defying death. Back to the divinity, if it's not your kid, it could be a dominance thing, cuckoldry, and all of that. So MPreg, of course, can be any of those things. But there's also an extra layer of defying nature or miracle working, the divine in a new form, as long as you're talking about cis-man on cis-man. So how does MPreg work as sublimation beyond normal pregnancy? Well, I'd posit internalized homophobia can sometimes sublimate this way. There's conversation surrounding parents who have a moment of struggle when their child first comes out as LGBT. You know, they might have to take a moment to accept the death of the life they imagined for their child in order to make room for the true and therefore even better life that they're actually going to have when they're true to themselves. Well, when you're gay, you might also have to have that period of mourning for yourself, especially if it's not a realization you have immediately. You could build up this idea in your mind of a heteronormative life waiting for you. When you find out that that's not in the cards, what might happen? What do you do with expectation that perhaps you as a gay man are meant to have a wife and a child? MPreg lets you live in the fantasy where you can have everything. Your husband can be your wife. He or you can get pregnant with your child. Rather than give voice to and struggle through that barrier to your own happiness, you can sublimate it into desire and thereby make it more acceptable, and you no longer have to do the uncomfortable work of working through it. Internalized bigotries can often show up in the erotic, as can the wounds of other people's external bigotries. You sublimate your pains into desire because pleasure is better. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. Yes, you probably do actually need to work through all of these things. Pushing them aside through sublimation more than likely isn't going to heal you, but it is better than letting it consume you. Don't get vored by trauma. And that's part of why it's absurd for certain NSFW platforms to ban the use of certain language. Take the F slur. It is, in a way, reclaimed. I make an argument about it in a different video. There are queer people who use it amongst their friends and whatnot. There are assholes who pretend it's fully reclaimed so that they can call people they dislike the slur and use it for its slurage. That's not reclamation. But then there are also people who eroticize it. It can be part of a desire for degradation, which yes, can be the flip side of an issue with self-esteem or a history of victimization. A gay person can eroticize homophobia in a way to reclaim and own their own traumas. That's not a weaponization of or an endorsement of bigotry, unlike what those terms of services may claim. Well, that's the only one I can speak on personally. I'm sure that's true across the spectrum for any potential moment of internalized bigotry or dealing with traumas. Now, you can be a gay guy who is entirely uncomfortable with that. You know, I'm personally uncomfortable with the F slur existing anywhere outside of the bedroom. That's the only place I personally have ever found it acceptable. Many people don't agree with me there, and that's fine. But a blanket claim that it is this horrid thing that needs censorship is incurious, inconsiderate, and honestly anti-art and dumb. Pushing for censorship is not going to save us, and it must not be allowed. A misunderstanding of desire and fear-mongering about its effects is not a valid reason for censorship. You can critique desire without arguing that desire must not ever be presented. And sometimes you might take one person's example of how they deal with their trauma and eroticize it, and assume that all people who eroticize this thing are doing that exact same thing when maybe it's entirely unrelated. 5. Come on, credit card companies. And I'm sticking with this fit for the rest of the video because honestly, I think it's kind of cute. And I don't feel that way often. So why do internet publishers have such censorship terms as we talked about in the first part? Do they not understand what fiction is? Well, in terms of filmed erotica, potentially, it does seem a lot of people have a problem understanding the fictionality and performance of adult film. Guys, it's not real. They are doing the acts, but they're characters performing. They're concerned with lighting and angles and visuals, sounds and stories. There is a literal plot. It is fiction. It is art. People who don't understand that, well, I don't want to be rude and say that they're dumb, but I do think that there is a lack of critical thinking going on. And your lack of critical thinking is not the responsibility of an artist. Ethical, consensual creation is what counts on the end of creators. Audience not engaging with the meta is a problem with the audience and with sex education. It is not a valid reason for censorship. So what's next? What about brand association? I don't buy that for OnlyFans and the like, but surely that's a valid argument for something like Amazon, right? As a company, they do a lot. If there's one thing the internet has made clear, it's that people will harass and harass over the slightest slight. Heck, they'll harass over a fever dream unrelated to reality. Though Amazon has the prime original edgy comic book TV show The Boys, which features a shrinking dude who goes inside his boyfriend's genitalia during a scene, you enter it with him through the camera and then he accidentally returns to full size, causing a very gory death. I really like The Boys, and I thought that scene was cool, partially because of how unhinged it is. But that would not be allowed in a self-published book on Amazon. If they care as much about association and complaints, The Boys wouldn't be allowed to get away with what it does, and that would be a shame. So I don't buy this argument coming from Amazon any more than I do for OnlyFans. It is an excuse that doesn't have any weight to it. Could it be that Amazon is anti-art and doesn't understand erotica and doesn't understand fiction and is anti-sex in general? I mean, I guess it could be. We've already established that a lot of censored desires people moralize against don't have much anything to do with the frantic misplaced concerns. We've talked about how Smashwords standards ban entire genres. Amazon and Smashwords genre classifications constantly to the miscategorization of books because they don't understand genre as a concept. Erotica is not allowed to have extreme violence even if the violence is not erotic in any way. That's a nonsensical policy. There's no way to ethically enforce that. And it's also lazy. It's pointless. It's a complete disregard for a duty to art and to their artists. It doesn't protect anyone. It has no purpose. So why does it exist? Well, the purpose of a system is what it does. Censorship. Credit card companies. There is a period of time when the content you're allowed to publish on Smashwords that you can't on Amazon was also banned on Smash. Why? Well, quite openly, because PayPal threatened them and other publishers. They told them to get rid of that content. Eventually, PayPal relented and Smashwords once more allowed that content. According to Reuters, PayPal didn't make this decision on their own though. Even their choice to make the original threat was caused by credit card companies. According to Reuters, PayPal told ebook distributors earlier this year that the original policy was in place partly because the banks and credit card companies it works with restrict such content. In an article around that time, Visa and MasterCard both clarified that they weren't looking to take action against erotica. So explicitly, they weren't going after the written form. But the PayPal fiasco made clear they might change their minds on that. So be careful. But PayPal is far from innocent in this ascetic nonsense. They back down from erotica for the most part, but they still have puritanical attitudes towards art in general. When Gumroad decided to smash its creators with the ban hammer, who did TechCrunch point the finger at? PayPal and Stripe explicitly, two payment processors. PayPal's policies don't let you buy sexually oriented digital goods or content delivered through a digital medium. Now you might think that would logically include ebooks. It doesn't, because they hit a sleeping giant with that policy and rightfully received a massive criticism that smacked them back into this century, and they relented. Now, PayPal might shrug and point to FOSTA as a reason, but that doesn't work here. Why are you not allowed to buy an erotic comic, PayPal? Give me the actual legal reasons. It's not because of FOSTA, because that's not how that law works. There isn't one. So what's the moral reason? Is it a complete misunderstanding of art? Well, they already went through this with the Smashwords scandal. They've had it beaten into their heads. They know that there is not a moral argument here that holds water either. So what is it? It's a political decision. It's a pro-censorship, anti-sex, pro-ascetics, anti-expression statement. I know I'm being quite pressed about this, but I don't really care. These companies have no business exerting the amount of control they do over the internet and art. Do you remember that brief period of time when OnlyFans was planning on getting rid of adult videos on its platform? Guess why they did that? To comply with the requests of our banking partners and payout providers. A TechCrunch article reporting on the proposed ban said, at the organizational level, however, the companies may find it difficult to scale due to the trepidation of investors and banks, both of which tend to avoid the industry in general as a vice, much the way cannabis and sex story startups have faced challenges. Pushback from financial backers and payment processors can effectively sink an entire business model. Gumroad's situation was blamed on PayPal and Stripe in that article. So let's go after Stripe for a little bit. Give PayPal a break. Are they any different? Well, you can't use Stripe for NSFW. Their FAQ reads, for now, due to various reasons, including requirements that apply to Stripe as a payment processor, requirements from our financial partners, and the potential risk exposure to Stripe, we can't currently work with businesses that sell or offer adult content or services. So you may be thinking, wow, the phrase various reasons including sure is vague and is probably hiding some internal decisions based on bullshit. Also notice how they buck the blame for the decision. Wise is another payment type thing. What do they say? They don't let you use them for adult content that's visual in nature, so I guess erotica is safe. I probably wouldn't risk it though. Cash App doesn't let you use it for NSFW of any sort. Venmo is owned by PayPal, so guess what they do and don't allow? Good guess, you're right. Businesses aren't allowed to use Apple Pay if they sell pornography, though what they mean by that isn't specified, so you can assume that's any and all NSFW content, including erotica. MasterCard doesn't let you use it for depictions of non-consensual activity, so that's going to include all non-con and dub-con fantasies. It's going to include a lot of romance novels. Do they understand adult content as art and that depiction is not endorsement and that fantasies are often about other things and that actors in adult content aren't acting? It doesn't matter. Sharita Ville points out that Visa and MasterCard almost operate as a duopoly. I mean, sure, Chase, American Express, and some others exist, but Visa and MasterCard have the majority of the market. That means when they collectively say jump, you better jump if you want your money. They are the ones you can blame for the bans on fake blood. And why? Are they afraid that it's real? Are they incapable of understanding that NSFW is not real? In that article, DeVille talks about how credit card companies and banks and payment processors don't want you to full puppet someone. You can't be a furry. They've historically been harsh on any form of bondage. They don't want choking. Wow. That sounds like all of the content that is restricted from these websites. It sounds like a handful of businesses have decided they are the ones who get to determine the limits of art and speech, which in this case are fictional and do not encourage harm. Depiction is not endorsement. They know this though. Of course they know this. These companies are not run by people with an inability to think. They are companies run by people with agendas, and their agenda is censorship, pure and simple. So let's talk about speech. 6. Desire. Everyone gets annoyed when they get censored. They start crying about definitions and technicalities when other people get censored. Is there a difference between presenting harmful misinformation as fact versus fiction with questionable content, obviously. Pretending otherwise is operating under extreme bad faith and dishonesty, or an extreme lack of understanding of how any of this works. Concerns over NSFW content are often used as a jumping off point to go after other people, to go after queer people. You claim a social contagion, you claim non-sexual acts are erotic, and you claim the erotic is evil. Asceticism is holy. You say gay people existing in art is the same thing as grooming children. You ban drag. You creep over so slightly forward to gutting the internet, emptying the libraries, and throwing queer people back into the closet. And the closet has bars this time. I'm a vociferous defender of art. I am against asceticism in all of its forms. Joy is more holy than self-denial, and it always has been. If you consider yourself a proponent for free speech, a defender of art, a defender of queer people, someone who yearns for an open and free internet, someone who doesn't want your life controlled by a handful of financial companies that pretend to know what is best for you while not caring one singular iota about the actuality of their decisions, then it is beyond time that we fix this problem. Write to Amazon, write to Visa and MasterCard, call up your representatives and senators, ask why these companies are allowed to have such control over the lives of the American people. There is a lot of content that I personally find repulsive. I don't want to see it, I don't want to read it, I don't want to think about it, and I'm not going to go out of my way to buy and consume art that contains it. The vast majority of that revolting content is defensible free speech and expression. I do not have to like it to defend it. It is art. It is desire. It is the core of the human experience, of expression. It is exploration and identity. It is love and hate. It is life and death. It is religion. It is blasphemy. It is every philosophical question known to man. These companies are doing all of us a vast disservice. My desire is that they stop. And I hope that you share that desire. And I hope it does not stay a fatal fantasy, because left to their devices, art and the internet will both die. Okay, bye. Please forgive my heartness. This might be the last call before the end. I wish I smiled more and held the door for you. I wish that we could hug and laugh and love. This regret is a flooded tub that can't be unplugged. What I want to say is I did some bad things. Sometimes I lost my way. I failed the big test. I burned that blue dress you got for me when I was 10. I smoked and drank and abandoned my best friend. We were dropped in a forest and told to pick the right path. We saw white bark, juniper, and pine leaves, but there was no right path that I could see. There were too many choices, some not a road in sight. Hey mom, I love you. Please remember me. No daddy, don't cry. Tell me it will be alright. Oh, the end and beyond. I hope your love for me can last. I lived a cursed life and brought you this strife. What did I do to end up on this path? Dear God in heaven, if you are out there, please cast your eyes here. I was not perfect, but I don't wanna die. Please don't let me disappear. Where are you hiding? Are you just watching? I hope it's entertaining when you brought us and you see us shiver in the dim lights while you warm us up for hell. For hell, Father, please forgive my anger. Please forgive my fear. Father, be with my loved ones. Lay your hair around their faces, rock them to sleep and bring them peace. Bring us peace. Bring us peace. Mea culpa. Mea culpa. Mea culpa. Mea culpa. Mea maxima culpa. Dominus vobiscum. Amen. You know, I'm cute. Anyway.